We will now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Judge Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. You probably think you are in the lion's den. I don't think you are. You're handling the questions quite well. As the chairman alluded to, I'm a former judge, former prosecutor like you. In the justice system, we strive, whether we're prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, we strive for the goal of fairness. Whatever happens, whether it's a hearing on a search warrant, whether it's a criminal case, we strive for fairness. And things must not only be fair in the justice system, they got to look fair. And if they don't look fair, that's to us in the system, like you, just as bad as if it weren't fair. Prosecutors, when I was one, I had the rule, as you have, that prosecutors must seek justice, not convictions. That's our role when we were a prosecutor. Tried a lot of cases, and lawyers always wanted to know from the prospective jurors if they're biased, for or against one side. If they're biased, it's happy trails. They can't serve on the jury. So in this case, and it may not be an exact analogy, but here we have a jury taking place on a case. And we find out 5 of the jurors are biased for whoever they're investigating or hearing a criminal case. Neither side would tolerate that. They could not be involved in that proceeding. And in some cases, if we're proceeding in a trial and the jury's biased in the outset, there's a mistrial. We may try it again, or it may be dismissed with prejudice, depending on the severity of the bias. But in this case, we got 2 named individuals, Page and Strzok. We know who they are. We know what they've done, all of the things that you've mentioned. But there are also 3 other unnamed biased people based on your investigation, 1 lawyer and 2 other FBI agents. What are their names?
So as I mentioned earlier, Congressman, the request has come in from the committee to give their names. We went to the FBI. The FBI raised a concern because they work on counterintelligence matters. And we are working with the committee to try and get the information you've asked for to the committee.
The FBI does not want their names released.
Correct.
And so the FBI makes the decision as to who those other 3 biased people are, and they say, we're not telling you because of some other internal reason on what they also work on, counterintelligence, right, which, whatever that means to whoever's hearing it. So my point is, we let the FBI determine not to tell us who the other 3 biased people were in this 500-page investigation that we all now have. Mm-hmm. Does that seem a little odd to you? I'm just asking your opinion.
Yeah, no, and there's a legitimate request, reasonable request from the committee, and I don't think it is a final decision at this point from the FBI, or, in my view, a final decision. It's something I'm looking forward to working with the committee to try and get the answers to, because I completely understand what the interest is of the committee in getting that information.
Well, it just seems to me that in the name of fairness, we ought to know the names of those 3 people who you determined were biased in this investigation that has taken place, this 18th month investigation that you have been working on. I think that's fairness, and I think the American public would like to know who they are. I think in this issue, changing gears a little bit to Comey, he has done a great disservice to the reputation of the FBI. I mean, when FBI agents would walk in my courtroom back in Texas, you know, the jury wanted to stand up and say the pledge because they just trusted what they were going to say. I think now those days are over because the investigation must not only be fair, it has to look fair, and it no longer looks fair as to what the FBI is doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many years have you known Jim Comey?
He was in the U.S. Attorney's Office when I started in 1991 there. So sometime after I started in 1991, I obviously...
How many years do you think y'all worked in the same area? 8 years, 10 years?
No. He left, I think, within a year or two of my arriving to come down to Virginia to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office there. I'd have to go back and try.
And then in your position at Justice, he was at FBI, so you had...
When I became IG, a year later, he became the FBI director.
So you've known him long enough to have an idea about what his reputation for truth and veracity was among other members of his, the Justice Department and the FBI. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what was his reputation for truth and veracity?
He had a very strong reputation.
In your report, do you ever say at any point that Jim Comey lied?
We do not.
Do you know of any time when Jim Comey has lied?
I can't think of any as I sit here.
So when President Trump said there's not a person who's told more lies in the world than Jim Comey, you would disagree with that?
I'm not going to answer what other people's views are or think. I can only speak to what my interactions with him were.
Thank
my
you.
capacities.
I know that your report basically said that Jim Comey was exceedingly careless in coming forward before the election with his reportage of the renewal of the investigation of Hillary Clinton and the laptop and Anthony Weiner. But there was no malicious intent. Is that accurate?
As to Mr. Comey, we didn't find any malicious intent.
And what he did could have possibly affected the election. You don't know that it did or didn't.
No,
it could have, but it could have. And he also could have gone into the Trump-Russia investigation, which could have affected the investigation, and he didn't. Is that correct?
When you say go into, I'm sorry.
He could have let the public know that there was such an investigation.
The only thing I would say is he did not do that, which was consistent with policy.
Some of the attacks were made on your decision not to prosecute, or the Justice Department's decision not to prosecute Secretary Clinton, and they stem from the Justice Department and the FBI's interpretation of the legal statute in term gross negligence. The Justice Department and FBI interpreted the statute to require deliberate intent, and they agreed there was simply no evidence in the Clinton case. And your report examined this and stated, we found this interpretation of Section 793 (F) was consistent with the Department's historical approach in prior cases under different leadership, including the 2008 decision not to prosecute former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales for mishandling classified documents. Mr. Horowitz, did you find the Department's prosecutors investigating Secretary Clinton considered both the case law and the Department's previous decision to decline the prosecution of Mr. Gonzales?
Yes.
Can you explain to us a little bit about the decision not to prosecute Alberto Gonzales and how that was similar to or parallel to Secretary Clinton?
Well, I think the issue there, and I'd have to go back and refresh myself on the Gonzales case, but it was the fact that it wasn't being sent to a third party who or classified information was being provided to a third party, and some of the other factors overlapped with the factors in this matter, according to the prosecutor's assessment.
The FBI has been referred to in somewhat disparaging terms since this report. Did your report find that the rank and file of the FBI were at all guilty of bias?
No, not at all. In fact, as we lay out in the conclusion here, they've worked hard to create a strong reputation. And as we know, conduct like this creates such harm to that reputation that's been built up that's why it's in part so important to address and to avoid having this kind of activity occur.
Mr. Chairman Gowdy, my friend, said that confidence in our system of law enforcement and public prosecutions is important to confidence in our government and the rule of law, and I agree with him. Would a statement to say that the FBI was a den of thieves contribute to the soured climate that we have in this country towards law enforcement and the rule of law?
You know, Congressman, I'm going to stick to what we've concluded in our report, and others can assess what they think this
is there a den
means.
of thieves at the FBI?
We in this investigation or any others we've done, we've not identified a den of thieves.
I thank you for your service and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Good afternoon, Mr. Horowitz.
Good afternoon.
I just want to go through the report a little bit. Mr. Horowitz, is it true that regarding the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton?
Mr. Chairman, I think the gentleman's mic's not on.
Do I get 10 more seconds?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Horowitz, isn't it true that regarding the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton's email servers, also called the mid-year review, your report found, quote-unquote, no evidence that the conclusions of the Department of Justice prosecutors were affected by bias or improper considerations?
Correct.
And isn't it true that the report found that decisions made during the 2016 campaign mid-year review were, quote-unquote, based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice?
Correct.
Now, turning now to Agents Strzok and Page, it is true that your report says that their actions brought discredit to themselves, correct?
Yeah, correct.
However, it's also true that you, quote-unquote, did not find documentary or testimonial evidence directly connecting these political views that these employees expressed in their text messages and instant messages to the specific investigative decisions that you reviewed.
Correct.
Now, unpack that for that. How could it be that these two individuals who texted back and forth, and I reviewed hundreds of these texts, they're unprofessional, they say bad things about Donald Trump, they say bad things about Hillary Clinton. If they knew me, they'd say bad things about me too, I'm sure. How could it be that these two individuals who are tainted by this political bias could have done what they did, and yet you say that the ultimate decisions made by the prosecutors were not tainted by political bias?
So the reason and how we got to our conclusions was by looking at all the records of all the individuals involved in the specific decisions we looked at, as well as the prosecutor's ultimate decision. And going through those records, the question was the biased evidence by those individuals translated into action by what turned out to be, in most instances, other people.
Oh, so other people were involved.
Others
Is that
were
what you're
involved.
saying?
Correct.
Oh, so it wasn't just Strzok and Page who called all the shots on this investigation?
Certainly, as to the decisions we looked at pre-July. Again, I'm separating out the October events because in that instance, Mr. Strzok was a key decision maker.
Okay, so let's unpack this. There's more than two people involved here in investigating the Hillary Clinton email server situation. How many other people were involved?
My understanding there was somewhere over a dozen, so whether it was in the 15 or so range, I don't have a precise number, but it was certainly in that 10 to 15, 20 range.
Oh, wow. So as many as 20 people could have been involved in basically making decisions of this group. And what you're saying is that these two people, though they personally may have been tainted by political bias, did not railroad the other 20 into making a decision that was politically tainted.
That's in looking at those decisions we're talking about, that's precisely the case. There was either a broader team decision or the prosecutors, not the agents, who made the decision.
Got it. Now, let me take you to another point. You would agree with me that Jim Comey, although he did announce that there was an investigation into Hillary Clinton, did not announce any investigation into Donald Trump, correct?
In October, in that fall period, he did not announce the ongoing Russia investigation or, for that matter, as I said, the Clinton Foundation
Correct.
investigation.
Now, Strzok and Page, if they wanted to really tank Donald Trump the way that some of my colleagues assert that they wanted to do, could have leaked that this investigation was happening. But you did not uncover any evidence that Strzok and Page did that, did you?
We did not uncover evidence that they disclosed the Russia investigation, and that was one of the arguments their lawyers made as to their conduct. In
fact, there's no evidence in your report that anybody leaked evidence of an ongoing investigation into Donald Trump in Russia, correct?
We didn't touch on the Russia investigation in this. This was focused on the Clinton email investigation. I will say that obviously we're looking at the leak question. That's could be a broader question depending on what we find.
Sure, but in this report, there was no
report does not
evidence there.
reference that.
Correct. That's what I thought. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for your time and testimony here today. You did determine in your report that there was political bias against President Trump, evidenced by the Strzok Page text, correct?
Correct.
Okay. These same agents assigned to the Clinton investigation were then assigned to the Russian probe, correct?
Correct.
Do you think that this probe, the Russian probe, then could potentially have been tainted by the same political bias?
I'm not going to opine on that, Congressman. We focused in this review on the mid-year investigation. As you know, we have the ongoing work that we're doing, so I'll defer on that if I could.
But it's reasonable then, if you found agents with political bias against the president that were then assigned to the Russia probe, that certainly that is something that needs to be looked at.
It's certainly a reasonable question and something, as I said, that we're looking at in our ongoing review.
Now, I assume you watch the news?
Occasionally. I try not to, actually, as much as perhaps I have in the past. But
do you believe that there is anti-Trump bias in the news, not as Inspector General, but just as a private
I'm not
citizen?
going to opine on that.
You don't have an opinion as a private citizen?
I might have a private citizen opinion.
But you won't in the hearing?
No.
Okay. Would it surprise you to know that 90% of the mainstream media coverage is anti-Trump?
Again, I wouldn't weigh an opinion on that, Congressman.
Okay. Would it be safe to assume that FBI agents and attorneys watch the mainstream news?
I assume the public at large does, and since they're part of that, I assume they do.
Okay. So I guess what I'm getting at, wouldn't it be fair to conclude that some of the biased coverage has impacted their ability to fairly conduct their investigation?
I couldn't draw that. I wouldn't be able to draw that conclusion sitting here, Congressman.
Okay. While your report highlighted some of the most blatant anti-Trump sentiments within the FBI, it concerns me that this problem is more pervasive than we think. The FBI is oath-bound to remain neutral and enforce the law impartially and fairly. How can we accomplish this when there are agents that are actively biased against our sitting president?
Look, I think, Congressman, you know, having been in AUSA, worked with agents, tremendous agents at the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. The one thing I thought we all understood is you're entitled to be, and you should be part of the public, the government, the democracy that we live in. But when you get to your office, you leave your views outside the door when you walk through, and you just focus on your work, the law, the evidence, and that's what you focus on.
Knowing what you know, though, if you were the subject of the investigation and knowing that the people you just investigated were the ones doing the work, would you not be concerned?
Look, I think, again, it goes to what I just said. I was a public corruption prosecutor, and the most important thing, I supervised our unit. People who were working on those cases needed to leave whatever their views were outside the office. They needed to come in and be committed to focusing only on the facts and the law.
But that didn't
That's what we
happen in this
expect.
case. That didn't happen, at least with multiple agents that you
Well,
investigated.
certainly with regard to what occurred in October, we were concerned that that did not happen.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our chairman, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Dr. Desjardins. Mr. Horowitz, I'm trying to understand. The drafts of the Comey memos indicated that the missing element was the failure to expose the material to potentially hostile actors. And then I'm going back to his press conference and his subsequent testimony where he said the missing element was intent.
Right.
So I want you to put on your old hat. It's rare when your job is to prove intent that you have a defendant or a suspect who walks in and has a card out and says, to whom it may concern, I would like to admit that I had the intent to commit a violation of each and every essential element of the offense charged beyond a reasonable doubt. I've never had that happen. Have you?
Can't recall that happening.
You have to prove intent with circumstantial. Usually it's circumstantial evidence. Rarely do you have direct evidence of intent. Is that fair?
That's fair. Although there are times people do things on camera and admit things in a wiretap that gives you pretty good evidence of intent.
Those don't go to trial that much. Sometimes those plead. When you're going to trial, the best you can have sometimes is circumstantial evidence.
Sometimes that is the best.
All right, such as false exculpatory statements, false non-exculpatory statements, concealment, destruction of evidence, knowledge, absence of mistake, notice of wrongdoing. I can't think of a better source for that potential circumstantial evidence than the actor, the target, the defendant, himself or herself. Can you?
That's usually where you find some of your best evidence.
All right, I'm out of time. If any of my colleagues give me any more of their time, I want to close the loop on how to prove this missing element and whether or not, in your judgment, in this case, a fulsome effort was made when they did interview the target. With that, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Microphone.
This one's working. Okay, Mr. Chairman, between Republican-led committees, there have been numerous hearings on the topic of Hillary Clinton's emails. Hillary Clinton has been the gift that Republicans can't get enough of. The American people will recall that during the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, House Republicans held numerous hearings about then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. We remember what House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy admitted when he told a reporter, quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why? Because she's untrustable," end quote. Well, Mr. Chairman, the day finds us again mired in another hearing about Hillary Clinton's emails. And instead of holding hearings to muck up Hillary Clinton, today we're holding this hearing hoping that the American people are distracted from important issues of today. As chants of "lock her up" fade from our memories, our consciences are being disturbed as we hear the ProPublica footage of the little children crying, "I want my mama. I want my daddy." As I prepared for this hearing last night, all I could hear were the cries of those children being held in private for-profit jails, crying out for their parents. Mr. Chairman, I think we should have hearings about how the Trump administration is deporting their parents as those children remain wards of this country. And we also can be looking into issues like what was reported last week, the New York Attorney General's investigation and criminal referral to the Department of Justice. The same day that the OIG report came out, New York Attorney General, his office, or her office, sued Donald Trump, his children, and the Trump administration with alarming allegations about flagrant violations of the law and potentially criminal acts. The New York Attorney General found, and I quote, "In sum, the investigation revealed that the foundation was little more than a checkbook for payments to nonprofits from Mr. Trump or the Trump Organization. This resulted in multiple violations of state and federal law because payments were made using foundation money regardless of the purpose of the payment. Mr. Trump used charitable assets to pay off the legal obligations of entities he controlled, to promote Trump hotels, to purchase personal items, and to support his presidential election campaign. The complaint included images of emails from campaign staff such as Corey Lewandowski directing political spending out of the foundation's accounts. It included a note clearly in the president's own handwriting directing foundation money to be used to settle a lawsuit against Mar-a-Lago, his country club estate for the ultra-rich. This is simply stunning. The New York Attorney General alleged that there were, quote, multiple violations of state and federal law, end quote. The New York Attorney General sent an official criminal referral letter to the IRS and also to the Federal Election Commission to investigate tax and election law violations. The letter to the FEC copied an official from the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. Now more than ever, we need strong and independent oversight to ensure that federal law enforcement and prosecutors can do their job free of political pressure. Based on the President's past statements and actions, I have serious concerns that he or his political allies will attempt to make this new potential criminal case go away. And so I think we will once again need to rely on your office, Mr. Horowitz, for that oversight. Can you commit to us here today that your office will look into this criminal referral to ensure that there is no improper outside influence or inside influence, for that matter, including any attempts from the President or his staff to shut down an investigation into the conduct of the President or his family?
So certainly matters that are within our jurisdiction and our authority, we're prepared to conduct appropriate oversight on. There are some things that will be within our jurisdiction, some things that are not within our jurisdiction, and I think it really depends ultimately on what comes to us in terms of a referral or not, if and when one does come. So that's what I can tell you in a hypothetical, but that is why we're here as Inspector General Office, and if it's within our jurisdiction, we will obviously take any referrals and look at it carefully.
I thank you for your exhaustive investigation in this report. I think you've done a great job, and I thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, did Lisa Page work on the Hillary email investigation?
She did.
Did she work on the Russian investigation?
She did.
Did she work on the Mueller investigation?
Yes, she did.
When you or your people asked her why she used her FBI phone for personal purposes, what did she tell you was the predominant reason?
Well, as she indicated, she and Mr. Strzok were having a relationship, and they were using the phone to communicate with each other for that purpose.
To cover up the affair, to keep their spouses from knowing?
Yeah.
So she texted something that you asked her about. This is an April 1st, 2016 text. I want you to tell me why she told you she sent this text. She said, so look, you say we text on that phone when we talk about Hillary because it can't be traced. You were just venting because you feel bad that you're gone so much, but it can't be helped right now. What did she tell you was the reason she sent that to Strzok?
She told us this was an example, and I'm looking at our report here, why she had used the phone to keep this information from her spouses, and this was an example of that.
And in this text, she said she was coaching Strzok, basically, on what to tell his wife, correct?
Correct.
So she was telling him how to lie. She was using a government phone to tell her husband how to cover up an affair, coaching him on how to lie, and using the pretext of this investigation to carry out this affair with her coworker. So she coached her coworker and lover on how to lie to his wife, used government resources to do it in the pretext of this investigation to conceal what they both knew was immoral behavior. Did that give you any reason to doubt her testimony to you in the interviews?
I think, frankly, as to all the individuals, when we go in, we come in with a healthy skepticism, as you would expect us to, and I think we treated her no differently than when we treat others in terms of going in and looking. And I think, as you can see here, we express our skepticism of some of the explanations we got.
Your report's really good at uncovering bias. I want to talk about some bias that has been uncovered by your report that's not been covered in the news. I want to read you 5 texts. March 12, 2016, Page forwarded an article about a conservative candidate in Texas stating, "What the F is wrong with these people?" Strzok replied, "That Texas article is depressing as hell, but answers how we could end up with with Trump as president. August 26, 2016, Strzok sends to Page, just went to Southern Virginia Walmart. I could smell the Trump support. August 29, 2016, Agent 5 to Agent 1. I would rather have brunch with Trump and a bunch of his supporters like the ones from Ohio that are retarded. October 28, 2016, Agent 5 lists things that he's sick of, and he lists on there the average American public. And then on November 9, 2016, unnamed FBI employee says, Trump supporters are all poor to middle class, uneducated, lazy POS. We know what that stands for. That think he will magically grant them jobs for doing nothing. They probably didn't watch the debates and aren't fully educated on his policies. This is bias of the FBI at the top level. I'm not saying at the field agent level. They probably more reflect the American people. But at the top, highest, most level, you have a bias against the American people. And this terrifies the average worker who's paying their salary with their tax dollars. So I think that's something we need to look at. I want to yield my remaining minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Horowitz, James Comey, Director of the FBI, Andy McCabe, Deputy Director, Chief of Staff Jim Rubicki, General Counsel Jim Baker, FBI Counsel Lisa Page, and Deputy Head of Counterintelligence Peter Strzok. These were 6 important people at the FBI, is that right?
Correct.
And they were the key players on the Clinton investigation and on the Russian investigation, correct?
They were certainly important on both.
Has Mr. Comey been fired?
Yes.
Has Mr. McCabe been fired?
Yes.
Did Mr. McCabe lie under oath, according to your report?
In our view, yes.
Yeah. Is there a criminal referral for Mr. McCabe?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Has Mr. Rubicki left the FBI?
Yes.
Has General Counsel Jim Baker left the FBI?
Yes.
Was he removed from his position prior to leaving the FBI?
I'm not sure of that.
Has Lisa Page left the FBI?
Yes.
Was she reassigned prior to leaving the FBI?
I believe so.
And has Peter Strzok been removed from his position as Deputy Head of Counterintelligence?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Horowitz, you've been in the DOJ for 10 years. You've been Inspector General for 6 years. You're Chief of all the Inspector Generals. Have you ever seen anything like this at any other federal agency in your time in the federal government? 6 of the top people fired, demoted, reassigned, or left?
I obviously can't speak broadly to other areas that I haven't known before, but yes, this is
I've been in this town 11 and a half years. I've never seen anything like this. Even the IRS scandal didn't come close. Never. And again, this is not in any type of reflection on the rank and file agents who I know you respect, we all respect, and do a great job. But these were the 6 key people. I have never seen anything like this in my time in government. My guess is there's not a person on this dais who has as well.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland, Professor Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Horowitz, our committee seems deeply lost in the forest today. A lot of my constituents are baffled why at a moment when the U.S. government is separating thousands of children and parents at the border in a way that threatens to make us an international pariah, the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee are doing nothing about this scandalous policy, but rather seem stuck in a time warp doing another investigation into an investigation into an investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. The amazing thing is that the majority chose to re-enter this maze when your report was perfectly clear on its findings, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and the department practice. Indeed, you seem to find that the major case of prosecutorial wrongdoing here took place at the expense of Secretary Clinton. While Director Comey properly kept secret the FBI investigation of the Trump campaign's involvement with Russian agents throughout the campaign, he repeatedly ignored department policy to release information about the Clinton email investigation. Mr. Horowitz, did you make a finding about why Director Comey violated DOJ policy and tradition in the Clinton case while steadfastly refusing to talk about Trump-Russia? This might have cost the Democrats the election, and Comey, of course, was a lifelong Republican. Was he motivated by partisanship and bias? Was that something that you found?
We did not find that Director Comey's decisions were based on political bias.
Do you think we're making a mistake not to blame that decision on partisan bias because he was a Republican?
Again, I'll stick with our finding, which is that we did not see evidence of political bias.
Well, all of this seems to come down to, in my view, the texts in this sophomoric texting relationship between Strzok and Page, a couple now made almost as famous as Bonnie and Clyde or Romeo and Juliet by this committee. We've all read and heard these titillating messages between the two. Sure enough, they don't like Donald Trump. They're very snarky about him. They called him an idiot. They were also snarky about Eric Holder, Chelsea Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and my good friend Martin O'Malley. So if the question is whether they like Donald Trump, of course not. They called him an idiot. But your job as the Inspector General is not to diagnose their private biases as government employees, but rather the character of their public actions. Mr. Gohmert seemed to think it's sufficient to disqualify public prosecutors or investigators because of their private biases. And I'm wondering whether you could illuminate for the committee the difference between a private bias or a political opinion someone might have and a public bias that actually gets activated in the character of a public investigation or policy.
I think fair to say if you are involved in a democracy, whether you're an federal prosecutor, an agent, or just a citizen going about your business, you have views, political views. You vote, you have positions. That's what you would want people to do and be engaged in democracy. When you are a law enforcement agent, when you're a federal prosecutor, you have to understand and appreciate that whatever your views are as a citizen, you keep them outside the office and away from your decision-making. And what was troubling here is, and I understand the explanation that was provided to us by Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page, that they thought these were private, but they weren't. They were using their FBI devices, sometimes at work, sometimes not at work, to speak about individuals they were investigating. So they weren't just speaking about a generic election that they cared about. It just so happened that the people they were speaking about had a connection to the investigations they themselves were working on. And in some instances, they tied that discussion to their investigative work. And that's what's concerning.
Okay. When these text messages came out, it turned out that that representatives of the Department of Justice actually convened a select group of reporters in advance to show them the texts, and there was great mystery about why that happened. Have you made any progress in investigating why this was leaked in advance by the Department of Justice to certain reporters?
Yeah, we haven't undertaken a full investigation of it. We made clear that to the committee that we were unaware of that until after it happened and we got complaints in from it. We were told it was considered by the department and by its lawyers. And so, as you know, the IG doesn't have authority over decision by lawyers in the course of their legal authority. Under the IG Act, those go to the department's Office of Professional Responsibility, and so they would be the ones that would have to be consulted as to what they ultimately found.
So you're doing no further investigation?
We don't have jurisdiction, actually, because what we first learned right away was that lawyers had been consulted and lawyers had given advice. And once that happens, while we would, and the committee has supported giving us that jurisdiction, at this point we don't have it.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horwitz, thank you, and for your entire team, some of which are Republicans, some of which are Democrats, some of which are unaffiliated. I thank you for your unbiased way that you conducted this comprehensive report, and just for the rest of the team at large that's probably back at DOJ watching this. And so I want to get right to the heart of the matter. One of the concerns I have when we look at bias in the analysis that you made at the very end, it is incumbent upon any team to make sure that they do the investigation without bias. And it's clear that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page had some bias. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so if you were to learn that they had a disproportionate role in the investigation, both on this investigation and the Russia investigation, that would mean that their bias would have a disproportionate contribution to that decision, would that not?
Yeah, and I'm going to stick to this review since I know this one at this point, but yes, right, that would be a concern.
So let me go further. You're the one that actually discovered the text messages.
That's correct.
Your forensic team.
Correct.
So why would the FBI not have been able to find that?
So
did they look?
Well, the first batch we recovered in 2017,
right.
we found because we asked for text messages.
All right, and so they produced them to you.
They produced them to us.
All
Then
right.
we
So the ones that you
more.
found forensically,
Correct.
Why did they not find those?
If you didn't do the forensic work on the phones, you wouldn't have found the text messages.
So they really
on the phone.
just didn't look, is what you're saying. The
Nobody
FBI
looked
didn't look
beforehand. Correct.
So you looked, but they didn't look.
They hadn't looked.
So was it a lack of curiosity on their part? I mean,
I think
because
you'd
you're
have
the
to
one.
ask the FBI on that as to why they didn't.
Well, but if
make
they
that
were
effort.
really serious about oversight and really serious with the confines of these text messages, I think an investigator would want to know if they had bias within their own agency, wouldn't you?
Yes, and I would just add, we've had those phones in our custody for probably about a year now or 6 months now. So just to be clear, we've had them for the last 6
Since
months.
then. Well, you've done a lot more with them than they did, and I'll give you that. And so I want to focus on what's not in the report, because as we look at what's not in the report is, as you know, the intelligence community, IG, actually was part of the predication for this investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
They were so concerned that there might have been foreign infiltration into this that they went immediately to the FBI to let them know about that. Is that correct?
I know they went to them. I don't know the sort of.
Well, I talked to the IG, and he indicated that he went literally that day, got in a car, went over and met. And so he was really concerned that there was some anomalies in the metadata that would suggest that a foreign actor was getting copies of potential emails. Are you aware of that?
I am, and I've talked to him as well.
Okay. And so if they are that concerned, do you not find it curious that the FBI investigators, Peter Strzok and his team, did not ever talk to them other than that initial meeting where they did that? Would you think that part of an investigation would be to go back to the very people that brought up the accusation and say, what did you find?
Yeah, I assume that would be what
But that's not in your report.
That's correct.
And they didn't do that, did they?
I'd have to double check that.
Yeah, I can tell you that the last time that they talked to them was when they gave the referral to close it out after the Comey incident. So wouldn't you find that curious, that they wouldn't have looked any further?
If they didn't, yes.
All right, and so you can get back to the committee on that. All right, so let me go on a little bit further. So if they didn't look, and if we don't have that information, your staff indicated that indeed emails with at least some classified information did go to a foreign entity or a third party.
Yes, one of the individuals who was on Secretary Clinton's staff, his email account, private email account, Gmail account, was hacked.
Right, and so let me look at 4 other things that I need you some clarification, because there's some text messages. We know that Peter Strzok worked on both the Russia and the Hillary investigation, so I want to make sure that these text messages don't apply to Hillary. So on July the 29th, before the investigation into the Russia investigation started, there was a text message that says, do you want us to reach out to Gervais? And I think they're referring to Gervais Griggs at that particular point. And they said, well, why do you want to do that? Well, we want to see if he actually has the names that we already have. Now, I'm troubled by this a little bit. Did that apply to the Hillary Clinton investigation? It was already closed.
It was already closed. I'd have to go back and double check.
Okay, why I'm curious is why would they be checking with someone who his specialty is, quote, FBI advanced electronic surveillance? Why would he be checking before a Russian investigation is open with somebody who does essentially bugging and monitoring to find out anything that might have been going on? Why would that have happened?
I don't know.
Okay. So let me go on a little bit further then. The text message that says the White House is running this, which happened on August 5th. Was that in reference to Russia or Hillary Clinton?
Our assumption and understanding was it was not Hillary Clinton's matter because that had been closed already.
That's my assumption as well. And the one that says that the president wants to know everything about this that happened on September 2nd, was that with Hillary or with the Russia investigation?
Our understanding is that would not have been Hillary, that would have been the Russia matter.
Yeah, so looking at the difference between the way that the Hillary Clinton investigation was notified and researched versus the way that it appears that the Russia investigation, did the administration, the previous administration, take an abnormal interest in all of that?
The gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Inspector General, but you may answer.
I don't know the answer to that at this point because that was not part of this review, but certainly it's something we, as we look at the matters that have been recently referred to us, we will be considering.
I thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. I want to see if we can summarize your findings after a long day going through your testimony. Do you agree, yes or no, that Hillary Clinton committed no crimes?
Our finding is that the prosecutors looked at the facts, the law, and the evidence to conclude she shouldn't be charged.
Okay. Do you agree, yes or no, that Page and Stroked acted inappropriately?
Yes.
And you agree that they were removed by Bob Mueller from his team?
He was removed. Ms. Page had already returned prior to our notification to the special counsel.
You agree that Director Comey never leaked the Russia investigation, the existence of it prior to his testimony to Congress?
He did not disclose it back at the time period we looked at.
You agree there's no evidence that Jim Comey lied to you in your investigation?
We did not make any finding that he lied to us.
Mr. Horowitz, do you think it's time to move on past the Hillary Clinton emails?
I think we've put forward our report. Congress has a separate oversight authority and interest, and I'm not going to speak to what Congress should or shouldn't do.
Because again, I appreciate your work on this, and I think it was fair findings all around, but the only text messages that I really care about right now are the hundreds of people at home and across the country who are asking me, what in the hell is the Judiciary Committee doing right now? I mean, this is maddening. I don't know if my colleagues are checking your voicemails or checking your emails or checking your Twitter feed. People aren't talking about the goddamn emails. They're not. They're talking about kids separated from their mom and their dad sitting in cages on our southern border. And then they say, hey, Congressman Swalwell, which committee is responsible for that? And I tell them, well, it's the Judiciary Committee. Great, so when you get back to Congress on Tuesday, you guys are immediately going to look at why this is happening, right? No, we're having a hearing, I tell them, but our hearing is on Hillary Clinton's emails. You know how upsetting that is? That's upsetting to Republicans, Democrats, people who don't give a rip about politics. This is important. People should be held accountable for inappropriate behavior, Mr. Inspector General. And again, I appreciate that you're doing that. But our responsibility is to act on behalf of the American people. And we're not helpless. We're actually the one committee in Congress that is not helpless to act when families are being ripped apart. So I would ask Chairman Goodlatte, please interrupt me if you intend, when we conclude today, to hold a hearing on how we're going to prevent future families from being separated and reunite those who have already been torn apart. Mr. Gowdy, again, interrupt me if you have a plan for what we're going to do next, what I can tell my constituents. Because the only thing they care about right now is that the United States that they know is no longer a compassionate one.
The gentleman may be pleased to know that on the floor on Thursday, as soon as Thursday, there will be a bill to address the very problem the gentleman is talking about. But it has nothing to do with the importance of making sure that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not repeat what it did in 2016 and into 2017.
In reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I understand that's a partisan bill without Democratic support, and that did not come through this committee. Again, we have an opportunity to act now. I saw Mr. Meadows at the White House today, and Mr. Meadows, I was encouraged by what you said, that families shouldn't be ripped apart, but here we sit, we're asking questions.
Well, if the gentleman will yield,
yeah.
I have a nonpartisan bill that does not deal with a wall, does not deal with sanctuary cities that I introduced an hour ago. If he would like to co-sponsor with me,
let's work on
bring
that.
it.
Yeah,
we'll bring it together.
Let's work on that, Mr. Meadows, because my constituents, and I think all of our constituents, want to make sure that we show compassion, that we show heart, and that Congress acts there's consensus on this issue. And it's just maddening that the one committee that has the responsibility to do something is focused on this. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, with the Wiener laptop issue, I think that you had said Peter Strzok's explanation for his conduct was not really persuasive.
Correct.
And so it would be reasonable for somebody to infer that his actions, at least with the Wiener thing, were motivated by his bias?
And that was precisely our concern.
Okay. July 31st, Strzok, this same Strzok, that's bias affects how he's handling the Wiener laptop, opens up a counterintelligence investigation against Trump's campaign. Why? We're trying to get the reason. Some guy made a comment in a bar, so he opens up an investigation. 8th of August, he's asked, Trump can't be president, right? No, he can't. We'll stop it. Why was that text message not originally produced to you? What did the FBI tell you?
So what appears happened is that its collection mechanism, the program it used, was not collecting all the text messages.
But you had every other text message from that day, correct?
Actually, I don't know the answer to that. I thought I did, but I'm not sure.
So when you guys went back recently and got this damning one, was that the only one from that day that you found that was new?
I'd have to go check, but there was at least one other. Actually, there were several others, but at least one other relevant to our review that we had not seen before that we found as we went back through it.
And that was, so is their explanation that it was not human agency, that it was some type
Correct.
of glitch?
Right.
Okay. Well, look, this is the most damning one of all.
Correct.
I guess theoretically possible it could be the glitch. I need an explanation for that. Now, the 16th of August, the infamous insurance policy text message. They have a scenario thrown out in Andrew McCabe's office that Trump can't win. Strzok says, no, we can't take that risk. We need an insurance policy. Their explanation that, we don't really know, we don't really remember the meeting. I mean, was it persuasive or credible how they explained that text message?
It wasn't persuasive to us.
It was. Totally not at all. And so here's the thing that I get with the insurance policy. If the investigation was validly predicated into Trump's campaign, who the hell cares whether he was going to win or not? If it's an investigation, you should want to do it. This tells me that they're saying, well, heck, if the guy may win, then we have to do this. Peter Strzok, the same guy, said, we'll stop him, who opened this up on the 31st of July based off some errant comment in the bar. This stinks to high heaven. Let me ask you this. The 3 other FBI agents who you're not naming, you said because they're involved in counterintelligence, correct?
Not me. The FBI has asked.
Well, why did we get Peter Strzok's name, though? That's what I don't understand.
Well, so what we do is when we prepared the report, we do an analysis under the Privacy Act federal law, and our determination was that because of the level he was at the agency, Deputy Assistant Director, the Privacy Act balance weighed against him, and we would make it public. As to the others, they're lower down.
Okay. Now,
the balance went the other way.
2 of the 3 had worked for Mueller. Is that
That's my understanding.
Do they still work for Mueller?
That's my understanding is no.
Okay, so they both did they get removed because of bias?
I believe at least one of them, and I can double check this, was removed after we alerted again the special counsel to the text messages. It may have been both of them, but I think it was one.
Is it fair to say that your investigation identified a culture of leaking in the FBI?
That's precisely what we say here and is a very big concern.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Clinton-Lynch tarmac meeting. Is that plane monitored in any way, either audio or visual monitoring, Lynch's plane?
I don't believe there's audio monitoring.
So you were never given any type of document that memorialized any conversation between the two?
No, not at all.
Okay. And what was your report's view of Lynch's explanation for the meeting? I know it was about a 20-minute meeting. She said it was about grandkids.
Yeah.
Could you fill up? I don't think she has grandkids. So what did you think? How did you guys view that?
I think we laid out there what the explanation was from former Attorney General Lynch, President Clinton. That was the sum total of the evidence that we had. And they both explained, and we detail here what they said occurred during the meeting. And that is the basis for our evidence at this point.
Comey in his statements to you guys said that there was, they were grappling with the Hillary stuff. There's no evidence of willfulness. But was there any doubt that Hillary intended to create a separate server. I mean, that was done willfully, correct?
Yeah, that was never the question.
Okay, so the question is, if you take a willful action and there are certain consequences that are reasonably foreseeable, I mean, there's certainly aspects of the law where you would be held liable for that. So you're setting up a parallel system, knowing you're going to conduct the main business of Secretary of State, one of the most sensitive positions in our government. The idea that Comey's acting like, oh, there was just no willfulness here, I didn't really find his explanation credible. I know you guys have looked at it, but I just wanted to put that on the record. I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands is recognized, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. I have since, I'm further down in seniority, I have the ability to now ask you some questions trying to clarify what my other colleagues were discussing with you. In your discussion with Mr. Meadows, there was a question that the text sent between Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page discussed the White House running this. You said you assumed that this text was not referring to the Clinton email matter and that you assumed it referred to the Russia investigation. I just want to clear up. Do you actually know who the text was referring to?
I'm sorry, when the particular
the text that says
person?
The White House is running this.
No, I think it was my understanding, just a general reference to the White House. I don't know if there was a particular person.
And if it was to discuss the Russia investigation, it's not the Russia collusion investigation by the special counsel. It's
Correct.
referring to the Russia election interference
Correct.
investigation, right? We have
Correct.
so many investigations
Right.
here. Let's keep them in line. Now, also in your discussion with Mr. Meadows, there seemed to be some logical analogy that was made. And as an attorney, that's one thing that we look at is the logical inferences. And I wasn't sure if it was necessarily correct. The discussion was that if you have a person who has a disproportionate bias in their personal, that you also then have to look at their disproportionate amount of decision-making in determining how that. Is that necessarily how one determines if their bias, in fact, affects the outcome?
I had understood it as that they would have a disproportionate, given their role, impact on decisions that were made.
Okay.
And that may be
and that's if their personal bias then bled into their work as well, correct?
Correct. And I think in terms of answering it was there did they in fact cause an impact, but rather, given their role, did they have a disproportionate?
So the disproportionate bias of Page and Strzok, in terms of their bias against now President Trump, was that disproportionate in size to their decision making?
I wouldn't know. As I said earlier, I don't have precisely which decisions they made over this period of time.
Let's move on to someone else who may have had a bias. My former boss, Director Comey, was a Republican, was he not?
I've read that. I don't know at the time.
I worked with him in a Republican administration.
I've heard also he changed his registration, so I don't know what the
So I worked with him in a Republican administration when he was the Deputy Attorney General of the Justice Department. Mm-hmm. Would his bias as a Republican and him being the decision maker have affected why he decided not to leak or not to discuss the Russia investigation itself?
Our concern about what Mr. Strzok did what Ms. Page does wasn't based on their political affiliation, but rather on the text messages. So whether
Did you
Mr.
know
Comey
their political affiliation?
I do not know their political affiliation.
But we know the affiliation of Mr. Comey, but we're not going to count that against him?
I think you have every right to register with whichever political party or none at all, and that
Sure, because we are still a democracy, are we not?
Correct.
But listening to my colleagues, it would seem that if anyone has a personal opinion about someone, that it should automatically exclude them from working in the FBI or working anyplace else, and that justices should not be blind anymore.
I don't think, and I don't think I've suggested that your personal opinion prohibits you from working in the FBI or the Justice Department. The concern here are the text messages that they exchanged about people that they were looking at.
I mean, before the election, many of my colleagues had a bias against Trump. But it appears now that he's the chief executive that they've all fallen right in line and follow right behind whatever he says, even though many of them made public statements against him and against some of the opinions that he had before he became president. In your investigation, you said you looked at 1.2 million documents, correct?
Correct.
And in those documents, which are now being subpoenaed by Chairman Gowdy as well as Chairman Goodlatte, on the documents for investigation on the FBI's handling of Secretary Clinton's emails, have you had access to all of the documents that the Justice Department has subpoenaed but haven't received? Isn't that correct?
The Justice Department, you mean the Congress has subpoenaed? Sorry.
Correct, yes.
Yes, we've had access to all the records.
And your office was able to review those documents and any other documents that's needed as part of your investigation for this report?
Correct.
And your report concluded, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the department prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practices." Correct?
Correct.
And so I just want you to be careful, because now that you have not followed the conclusion that the Republicans would like you to, you may in fact be up for a special counsel investigation yourself. And I yield back.
On that sobering note, Inspector General Horowitz, we will now go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could take it just a moment, I'd like to say thank you for your leadership. You have been the voice of justice, not just for today, but for more than 7 years. I have no doubt that you will continue to be a warrior against injustice and for the underprivileged, and I'm proud to have served with you and call you my friend. Mr. Horowitz, you previously testified that during the investigation, you found additional text between Agent Strzok and Page on FBI devices, which the FBI had not analyzed, including text about meeting in Andy's office. I'm assuming that wasn't Andy Griffith, Andy Cohen, or Andy Rooney. The closeness of referring to Andy bothers me a little bit, because evidently it says there may have been some relationships. Of course, according to your words, according to your report, somebody denies. Which one denies that meeting happened? Is it former FBI Director Andrew McCabe, or is it Peter Strzok?
I think the denial is that Mr. McCabe says he does not recall being present for that meeting.
Doesn't recall being present for that meeting. Have we investigated that further, or have you referred that to be investigated further? Because that's a pivotal point in all of this as far as what was said, who was involved in these meetings, whether there was intent or whether there was bias.
I think we have investigated, frankly, as far as we can take it, and could find evidence to see whether he was present. And, we've laid out here what we found ultimately.
Does it concern you that the FBI did not further investigate this issue of these discovered text messages? Seems like it raises larger questions with some of the behavior at the FBI. Does that offend you, bother you?
What has concerned us is that the FBI has this imperfect system of collecting records, has known that for some time, and needs to get it fixed. Frankly, once we started looking at these text messages, we were going to be the ones who kept digging to get them. So I didn't expect at that point the FBI to...
Fair enough. Because of Strzok's actions, I have a question. Can you with certainty express that the Hillary Clinton investigation was without bias or interference?
I cannot speak to every single decision that was made. He might have been involved in, and so I can't speak to that broader point.
So you're not saying that there wasn't bias. It appears that you are saying that bias may have existed in all of this, but not to the place that you could prove that it influenced the investigations.
Where we looked, on the decisions we looked at and the prosecutor's decision, we made the finding we felt we could make.
Do you understand why the American people are having some trouble with all of this? When you began to talk about, well, there's biased behavior, but is it a subjective call to where that bias level may have reached, whether it influenced? The amount of time that Peter Strzok spent as the lead investigator, do you understand why the American people would be upset at least the appearance of all of this?
Absolutely, and I'm upset at all of this. I think it's precisely why it casts a cloud over the investigation. It undermines confidence in it. All of those impacts are very serious and very significant on a very important FBI investigation. That should never happen, and it happened because of these text messages and what these employees were doing.
Sure.
It should not have occurred.
Well, thank you. And it's one of the reasons that you're respected on both sides of the aisle. I do remember, in fact, it might have been my question or another member on the House Oversight Committee, that when asked former Director James Comey as far as why not to bring charges, I believe his response that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges. As good as the job that you are doing, my question to you would be, is there any room that if there was other investigations or if there was other inspections, if you will, would people, do you feel like, do you agree with James Comey on your conclusion that this would be the same conclusion, or is there room that other people, other investigators may find different conclusions?
I think as you've seen in commentary about the findings in the report, what we try to lay out, this was the policy, this is how they reached the decision, and others are free to disagree with that.
When it comes to the number of FBI employees who were in contact with the journalists, was it the FBI employee or the reporter who seemed to initiate contacts that resulted in this back-and-forth conversation, or did they seem like long-term relationships?
Some of them, based on what we've seen, did not seem like looking at the charts here, you can see these are not, generally speaking, one call. So I would leave it at that. We're looking at that deeper question.
When you say you're looking at it, does that mean there may warrant more investigations for some of those who've been players in this situation?
There are active investigations ongoing by our office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by lamenting the fact that we are not having a judiciary oversight hearings to address this barbaric child separation policy. I just came back from Brownsville, Texas, and McAllen. It is despicable what is happening in our name. We're not having bills to address dozens of ideas to reduce gun violence in this country. We're not marking up the DREAM Act. We're not marking up legislation to protect the special counsel or to protect our elections from foreign interference. But alas, we're having another hearing on the Clinton emails. So let me just start with Mr. Horowitz with this basic question. Your investigation was to focus on the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails, correct?
Correct.
And was part of your investigation to examine whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians?
That was not part of this investigation.
Did you investigate or make findings about collusive behavior between the Trump campaign and the Russians?
The only matter we touched on with Russia was that October matter, nothing.
So I take it as a no. And was part of your investigation to review whether the President of the United States obstructed justice during the course of the special counsel's investigation?
We didn't. We looked at the Clinton
That's a yes or a no.
investigation.
Was that part of your investigation?
It was not.
Okay. And you didn't make any investigation or findings related to the President's potential obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
It had nothing to do with this investigation.
So the President's claim that your report makes clear that he's completely exonerated, there's no obstruction of justice, and no evidence of collusion is a lie, or at least unsupported by your report.
Our report focused on.
Does your report in any way support the President's claim that he's completely exonerated, there's no evidence of collusion, no evidence of obstruction of justice? The answer is no.
Our investigation focused on the Clinton email investigation.
And so your report does not contain any findings, not a single one in 500 pages, that would support the President's claim that your report, authored by you, exonerates him fully, presents evidence of no collusion and no obstruction of justice. Isn't that correct?
I'm going to focus on our report, and there are
Mr. Horowitz, the truth matters. Can you say in open that this... No, I'll finish my question. I get to ask the questions. Will you admit in open session that your report does not support the claim from the President of the United States that he is completely exonerated, that there's no evidence of collusion between his campaign and the Russians, and that there's no evidence of obstruction of justice? Your report does not investigate or make findings on those issues at all, does it?
We do not make findings on
that. So that would mean that's not a truthful statement. I'm not asking you to say that. I know it's hard for you to do that. It's the President. I get it. But it's important that the American people know that the 500 pages that you dedicated your career to developing with professionals does not support any such claim by the President. I'm not asking you for an answer. That's a statement. Yeah. Let me go next, Mr. Horowitz, to the part of your investigation that focuses on you may have heard the President and many of his allies make numerous statements about your report that were designed to make the American people believe the opposite of what is obvious from your report's findings, that the FBI's actions had an impact on the 2000 presidential election and in Donald Trump's favor. Your report found no evidence that the FBI or DOJ's conclusions in the investigation of Secretary Clinton's emails were politically motivated. And your report found that Director Comey violated Department of Justice policies by speaking publicly about Secretary Clinton's closed case in July of 2006 and by disclosing the reopening of the investigation in October of 2016. Isn't that correct?
Certainly the latter part. I
that violated department policy?
Yes.
Okay.
The earlier part I was...
Okay. And your report discusses why the Justice Department and the FBI have a policy and practice of refusing to speak publicly about ongoing investigative activity. It explains the stay silent principle exists to protect the privacy and reputational interests of the subjects of the investigation, and also the department's ability to effectively administer justice without political or undue outside influence, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that the FBI, when the FBI speaks publicly about an ongoing case, it risks harming a subject's reputational interests?
Correct.
And in this case, that subject of potential harm was Hillary Clinton.
Correct.
Your report, Mr. Horowitz, also has a subsection entitled Avoiding the Perception that the FBI Concealed the New Information to Help Clinton Win the Election. In that section, Director Comey says his decision to disclose the investigation reopening was to avoid, quote, corrosive doubt that you had engineered a cover-up to protect a particular candidate. Your report found, however, that Director Comey, quote, and this is your words, did not assess risks even-handedly. In weighing his actions, did Director Comey ever express fear that his notification to Congress would tip the scales, or at least appear to tip the scales, against Hillary Clinton in favor of Donald Trump?
I don't recall him saying that to us as sort of one of his explanations.
But Director Comey was afraid that if he stayed silent about the reopening of the case, that we would unfairly be accused of helping Hillary Clinton. Isn't that correct?
That was one of the concerns he expressed.
And so, sir, when the president said, when he praised Director Comey's actions, when he made that disclosure and said it took guts for Director Comey to make the move that he made, and, quote, what he did was the right thing, Chairman Goodlatte said he was very appreciative that Director Comey had the courage to step forward, and our very own Chairman Gowdy went on to Fox News and stated, Director Comey did the right thing in supplementing his testimony. Isn't it true, Mr. Horowitz, just to reiterate, your report concludes Director Comey's October 26th notification to Congress was not the right thing?
Yes, on October 28th.
That's
correct.
Right. And so I hope the Justice Department and the FBI learned their lesson from your report and do not cave to the ongoing bullying of President Trump and his allies in Congress. Instead, they must once again uphold longstanding principles and the rule of law, even while facing the onslaught of unfair political attacks. We expect nothing less of you. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Since my name was invoked, before we go to the gentleman from Texas, I would just point out that we don't live in a binary world. You can notify Congress without writing a letter that is publicly disseminated. You have other options, including notifying Congress in a confidential manner. With that, the former United States Attorney from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Inspector Horowitz, in your report and now in your testimony, you said that you are deeply troubled and very concerned that the anti-Trump bias reflected in the struck page text messages was so great as to have possibly impacted Peter Strzok's conduct in the Wiener laptop part of the Hillary Clinton investigation. Is that fair?
Correct.
So if the Department of Justice and the FBI's own Inspector General is very concerned and deeply troubled about Peter Strzok's anti-Trump bias affecting his actions as an FBI agent, is it unreasonable for President Trump, as the subject of an investigation, to likewise be very concerned and deeply troubled that Mr. Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation?
I'm going to step back on that, Congressman, and speak to the broader point that that's precisely why we were concerned, generally speaking, about the election review, that those kind of messages create that appearance of bias that undercuts credibility and the ability to do investigation. I can't speak to
Right. Well, I'm not asking you to make any findings about the Trump-Russia matter. I'm asking you about the people that you investigated in your report, people whose actions you found so deeply troubling and very concerning. I just want to find out if you think it's unreasonable for the president to feel the same way you do.
My concern on that is, as you know, we're currently reviewing that, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be myself seen as prejudging any outcomes here. So I'm going to let folks draw what reasonable inferences they want to draw from this, but I don't want to be seen as making any judgments on that.
Well, do you think it's unreasonable for President Trump to be very concerned or deeply troubled, as you were, that 8 days after Peter Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, that he promised another FBI employee, Lisa Page, that Trump would never be president because he'd stop it?
I think any individual in this country should be concerned about that kind of language.
And the reason you're concerned about that Inspector General, I think, is because you've said numerous times here that Strzok's stated bias and stated willingness to act on that bias are antithetical to the core values of the FBI, correct? Another thing that's antithetical to the FBI and the Department of Justice and our entire justice system is putting people in charge of investigating people they hate, of people that they are biased against and that they are prejudiced against, right?
Correct.
And we don't do that in our justice system. We can't do that in our justice system, a system where the bedrock principle has to be the fair and impartial administration of justice free from bias and prejudice, right?
Correct.
So I think the point that you're making and that I agree with is that anyone, you, me, any member of Congress, any American who becomes the subject of an investigation should not be investigated by people who have sent hundreds of hateful text messages about them before the investigation ever began and then continued to send them while the investigation was occurring. That is by definition prejudicial to the fair and impartial administration of justice, isn't it?
I think that is precisely the concern.
And yet that is exactly what happened to President Trump. Now, to your credit, Inspector Horowitz, you revealed the astonishing level, the outrageous level of bias and prejudice, and when you did, Special Counsel Mueller removed Peter Strzok from the case. But you and I are former prosecutors, and you and I both know that it is impossible to remove bias and prejudice from all of the actions taken, all of the decisions made, all of the investigative plans implemented, all of the evidence gathered by Peter Strzok and at least 2 other Trump-hating FBI agents and lawyers who were assigned to the investigation. That's pretty hard to do, isn't it?
Well, that is precisely the question, as you know, we're looking at.
So my colleagues over there just keep pointing out that your report doesn't state any conclusions about the Trump-Russia investigation. And they're right. The report doesn't state any conclusions. But your findings of fact about the people in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, in the case of Peter Strzok, for 9 months, the person in charge of the investigation, well, that leads to all sorts of undeniable conclusions about pervasive bias and prejudice against President Trump by the people who never, ever should have been in charge of gathering evidence against him. Let me switch topics in the remaining 20 seconds that I have. Did Jim Comey make the decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton before or after her July 2nd, 2016 interview?
I'm going to let you answer the question, even though the gentleman from Texas grossly misjudged the amount of time he does not have left anymore. It's actually 20 seconds over rather than under, but you can answer the question.
As we laid out here and described here, prior to the July 2nd interview, absent, as we were told, either a confession or false statements, the decision had been made to close the investigation.
So the fact that Director Comey testified under oath to members of Congress in response to a question about whether or not the decision was made before or after, unequivocally stated after, do you think it's reasonable for members of Congress to think that they were misled by that answer?
I'd probably have to look at the transcript. As you know, so much of that turns on the precise question and answer. So
can I take that as a promise to look at that?
I'll take a look at the question and answer, and then we can talk further, Congressman, about that.
Thank you, Inspector Horowitz. Appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. I want to commend you and your team for a very thorough report. You've taken extreme care to make sure you don't jump to conclusions. You've indicated where the lines are between judgment, acting in accordance with various protocols and norms and rules of the department and so forth. You've indicated that the bias that you've identified did not affect or contaminate the investigative decisions that were being made at the highest levels, which is important. When you focus on Jim Comey and his conduct, you point to issues of compliance with department guidelines and norms and standards that you think are very important. I think that's valid. I think it's also important to observe that that doesn't in any way get to the question of the credibility or truthfulness of an individual. You could say, this person is not adhering to what we think is a departmental standard. That doesn't go to whether they're being truthful, to their basic credibility and so forth. If I didn't comply with a rule on how much time I'm supposed to take here and asking you a question, then I went out in the hall and I saw someone knock someone else over and run down the hall, and I wanted to testify to that, you wouldn't say, I'm not going to believe you because you didn't follow the clock when you were in the hearing. And that's important because it may be that Jim Comey down the line becomes a witness in various contexts. And there's nothing in your report that I see, and I think you said this in response to Congressman Cohen, that would suggest that you have any reason to think that he has lied, that he misled you, that he was not truthful in the course of your conducting this investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I wanted to move to the question of, as I step away from this and I sort of don't consider particular individuals, but look at the standards you're articulating for what's a good investigation and how to carry it out, you've identified a variety of things. First of all, follow the rules that exist. Be consistent in following those. That's one of the major concerns you had in terms of the process for taking certain decisions on investigations. So be consistent, follow the rules. Another thing you've talked about is the importance of there not being leaks. And you've identified some issues with that at the FBI. But that is also, that goes to the overall legitimacy of an investigation, that there not be leaks. You've talked about the issue of bias, and I assume that your expectation would be that a good investigation would be one where if there's evidence of bias in a way that could affect the investigation, that steps need to be taken to address that bias.
Correct. Or the appearance, potentially.
Or the appearance of bias. So stepping away from that and thinking about those kinds of standards on how an investigation should proceed, you've actually left me in a position of being, having a lot of confidence in the way Bob Mueller is conducting his investigation. Because if you take those standards that you are highlighting and you apply them to how he and his team are conducting themselves, he passes with flying colors. Where there's been evidence of bias, he's taken steps. In fact, you acknowledge that Ms. Page, Mr. Strzok are not part of that team anymore because he took quick action when there was evidence of bias or even the appearance of bias. There's no suggestion that there have been improper leaks from this investigation. And by all accounts, both Bob Mueller and Rod Rosenstein are following to the T the rules and standards that ought to apply to investigation. So I want to thank you and your team for describing a set of standards for how to conduct an investigation, because I think when you take that set of standards and you apply it to the way Bob Mueller is conducting his investigation, you can see that he's doing it in a diligent, conscientious way as a straight arrow, and that's why I think we need to support that investigation. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. In late September of 2016, the FBI came into possession of the Anthony Weiner laptop, which contained hundreds of thousands of potentially emails related to the Clinton investigation. My first question, would you say that this discovery was rapidly communicated with the midterm Clinton investigation team and the FBI, or was it slow-walked?
The New York office promptly reported it to the mid-year Clinton investigation team.
Okay, and when did Peter Strzok, of course, he was leading the Clinton investigation, when was he made aware of the laptop?
On September 28th.
All right, so the next day or close within days. All right, so this is the same Peter Strzok has come up in multiple ways, repeatedly bashed candidate Trump at that time, and then committed to stop him from becoming president. Now, from from the perspective of his superiors, Bill Priestap, for example, was he at this time committed to the Clinton investigation, or was his focus more on the Russian investigation?
At the time of September 28th and 9th, Mr. Strzok was working on the Russia investigation.
And Mr. Priestap, I mean,
and his supervisor was working not just on that, but as you might expect as Assistant Director of Counterintelligence, a wide variety of matters as we lay out here.
Right. On page 297 of your report, Priestap said that the Weiner laptop was not his top priority at this time due to his involvement in the Russian investigation. You said that Priestap himself said that, I don't want to say distracted, but yeah, my focus wasn't on the mid-year anymore, and Strzok himself was assigned to both the Russian and Clinton investigations at this point, but he was still the lead in the Clinton investigation. So it's fair to say by your report that the superiors were distracted at this time. They were not focused on the mid-year investigation, but on the Russian investigation.
Correct. And to be clear, for Mr. Priestap, he was also talking about the election interference issues more broadly than just what has now come to be known as the Russia.
Which adds to the whole scenario that he was distracted. His focus was not on the Clinton investigation anymore. So here we go back to Strzok. All right, he is presented now with a choice. He receives the information from the discovery of the Weiner laptop, hundreds of thousands of emails potentially damaging and at least related to the Clinton investigation. He has a choice now to either follow up on the leads from that laptop and report them in a timely manner, or, knowing that his superiors are distracted, he can conveniently place this laptop discovery on the back burner. And so how long did it take Strzok and the mid-year team to finally get around to the laptop?
So there was activity the next day, September 29th, and then there was some discussions back and forth up through October 3rd or 4th, and then no activity whatsoever until the New York field office again raised a concern on October 21st, ultimately, or around October 21st, ultimately resulting in a call on October 21st from the U.S. Attorney's Office from the Southern District of New York to the Deputy Attorney General's office, inquiring about why there's been no activity.
So Strzok was taking this slow. I mean, he did not report it in a timely manner and pursue this thing. It was only after the New York group pushed it that Strzok got on board and said, we've got to do something about this.
Strzok and others, yes.
All right, but that's the timeline in all of this. And so, I mean, from every appearance, he did everything he could to prevent this discovery from becoming public because it may hurt the Clinton campaign. And you yourself stated that you could not, with any confidence, say that Strzok's political bias did not lead him to delay looking at the laptop. Do you still stand by that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is where the whole cycle comes back to me, where every appearance and action by Strzok at this point is that his political bias did, in fact, prevent him from bringing forth this information because it may hurt the Clinton campaign. And this is precisely really one of the big things that to me is just the elephant in the room, where there not only was political bias, but action based on that bias to protect one individual over the other, Clinton over Trump. And this is the same Strzok who is leading the Russian investigation, which of course is the foundation of the Mueller special counsel. So tremendous concern here. Again, thank you for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Inspector General Horowitz, how about we take a 10-minute break and then recess and then reconvene?
Whatever's good for the committee.
Does that suit you?
Don't
10
give it
minutes?
me.
10 minutes, we'll reconvene.
Okay.
This joint hearing, House Oversight, and the House Judiciary Committee's hearing started this morning at 10 o'clock and continued until about 1. They've taken a break earlier, taking a 10-minute break here. They expect more questions coming up, and we do want to remind you that we will re-air the entire hearing tonight, 10 o'clock Eastern, over on C-SPAN 2. Here on C-SPAN 3, we had planned to cover live the Senate Commerce Subcommittee hearing on the data privacy risks, the Cambridge Analytica and other Facebook partners and issues involving those organizations. That hearing is underway, and you can follow it online at cspan.org.
So good. my tolerance of like long like, is it that time they're like, we just, is it like my state?
For a second day, Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz is testifying on Capitol Hill about his report, the IG report on the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Yesterday on the Senate side, today answering questions at a joint hearing of the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees. They're in a short break here, should gavel back in shortly. All of this will re-air tonight beginning at 8 o'clock Eastern, and that'll be over on C-SPAN 2. We had planned to cover the hearing, consumer protection hearing, on data privacy risks, focusing on Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. That's airing live now at cspan.org, and this should resume shortly here on C-SPAN 3.
Mics aren't on. Hello? Yours isn't on, right? Doesn't sound like it. Is yours on? I don't think yours is. There we go.
See if that works.
Yes, can I reclaim my time, sir?
You've lost no time.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. It's concerning to me that we've spent almost 5 hours here of this esteemed body, which I am a member of, to discuss tapes of Hillary Clinton when we know that we have a humanitarian issue happening in our country that we need to resolve. But with that being said, President Trump fired Director Comey on May 9, 2017, and on May 10, 2017, Chairman Jason Chaffetz sent a letter to you, sir, asking that you investigate the decision to fire James Comey. Did you receive that letter?
I did.
You separately stated that if circumstances warranted, the OGI will consider including other issues that may arise during the course of the review, and the recommendation to remove Comey indeed warranted some consideration. Am I correct, sir? You said that.
Yeah, if circumstances warrant, we would expand.
Okay, my question to you is, did you expand the scope of your review into the 2016 election to encompass the fire of Director Comey?
We did not.
Why didn't you?
For similar reasons to what I mentioned earlier, which is my understanding that it may be the subject of an ongoing special counsel review, that there wasn't a reason for us to make a determination at that point in time.
Did someone direct you not to?
Nobody directed us not to.
Is your office currently investigating the firing of Director Comey?
We have not announced any review regarding that.
I didn't say announcement. Are you currently investigating?
As I said a minute ago, if there's a basis for us to look at it, we will assess and look at it. But my understanding is that it is something that the special counsel is reviewing, and
that's your sole decision to make.
It is my sole decision to make.
Have you encountered any attempts to interfere with, obstruct, or curtail that investigation?
Zero. No, of my own investigations. This investigation or other work, we've had no interference at all.
Has any entity or individual denied you witnesses or documents that you have requested as a part of your investigation that you have presented to us?
We got access to everything, and as we note here, 2 witnesses did not agree to voluntarily be interviewed by us, and we had no ability to compel them.
Is there, and I will ask you again, is there a role that your office will play in the investigation that does not interfere with Special Counsel Mueller's probe? We have multiple investigations that have happened with the Hillary Clinton emails. Why are you making that sole decision that because there is one investigation that you will not investigate the firing of FBI agent Comey?
As a general matter, Congresswoman, and it's not unique to this matter, as a general matter, when there are ongoing Justice Department investigations, FBI, others, we understand that we don't want to be in the middle of an ongoing investigation, and we defer and wait until the conclusion of that to assess whether there's something for us to review. And the special counsel, as does the Deputy Attorney General and others, understand that under the IG Act, if they see misconduct by Justice Department officials, they're obligated to notify us of that.
So you are stating on the record now that there will be no investigation from your office based on your sole decision of the firing of Director Comey?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have not made a decision with regard to the request we received as to whether we should or should not do that.
So how long will that process take for you to make a decision?
In all likelihood, until we understand that there is no other investigation going on of that within the Justice Department, we would wait until that point in time. And obviously
I would like to ask a question. Repeatedly, we've heard about the possible obstruction of the election of our current president. And last time I checked, even though the crowd's numbers don't match his statements, he is the president of the United States. So we are investigating whether a person's personal opinion is one that is conduct that we are finding to be, as far as employment, because it was a government phone, is that the issue that is the core of this? The fact that someone does not support a certain political candidate?
It has nothing, from my standpoint and our findings.
Well, that's been brought up multiple times today that you said because of the email where he said that we'll stop that.
My point being, it doesn't matter who he's trying to stop. What I've said repeatedly is, I don't care whether he was trying to stop the local election, the presidential election, or any candidate. An FBI agent cannot take a position or state like that they would consider using their official action to affect any candidates.
I agree with that, but I do not want a slippery slope that this president is immune to anyone not agreeing with him. And I've heard that repeatedly today as if it's a capital crime because someone did not agree or support. But I do support what you're saying in the role of an FBI agent, that we do not expect that. And I want to be clear, this is a democracy still, and we still have freedom of speech. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from the state of North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield my 5 minutes to you.
I thank the gentlelady. Inspector General Horowitz, I want to go back for a couple of minutes on the issue of intent. I mean, am I correct? Is that your understanding from what Jim Comey said, that the missing element was some element of intent that he was reading into the statute?
That's what he said. I think what the prosecutors were looking at was knowledge. And
knowledge of the wrongfulness of her conduct, or knowledge that her arrangement with herself may have allowed classified information to traverse her server.
Knowledge that classified information actually did transit through her server.
All right.
Because of the absence of markings.
Well, the questions I have for you are equally applicable, whether the missing intent is knowledge or intent. Can you think of a better way to determine what an actor knew than to ask the actor what he or she knew? Am I missing some better repository of evidence than to actually interview the target or the suspect yourself?
I would say there could be instances where there would be better evidence, like contemporaneous recordings, as opposed to the interview where the person might not be candid, but
I'm not aware of those in this case, but perhaps you know something I do not.
No, I'm not. But I'm just saying, you asked hypothetically, is there a better way to get evidence of someone's state of mind?
Given the evidentiary restrictions in this case, can you think of any better way to resolve that issue of knowledge than to actually interview the target herself?
No, I think you would want to interview the target herself.
All right. And what would you ask the target? You were a highly decorated federal prosecutor from one of the most prestigious districts in the country. What would you ask the defendant if you were trying to determine whether or not that person, that suspect, had knowledge?
Well, you'd certainly want to start at the beginning, which is, why did the server come to be set up? What was the rationale behind it? What did you understand it would be used for? Questions like that, because so much of it would be focused on what the intent, rationale, thinking was behind creating your own separate server or domain name from the outset.
If multiple explanations had been given in the past on that very issue, would you ask the suspect or the target to reconcile those different explanations?
Presumably you would ask the subject during the interview in any area where there might be differing reports of testimony or recollections.
If there have been false exculpatory statements made in connection with the fact pattern, would you ask the target or the suspect to explain those false exculpatory statements?
I think if you were interviewing any witness, you would want to ask them about information that was out there that would suggest there was a false exculpatory.
When I use the phrase consciousness of wrongdoing, what does that mean to you?
That means you have an awareness, perhaps unstated, that the conduct that you've engaged in is wrongful in some way.
What about concealment?
Well, that can mean, I guess, different things depending on the nature of the concealment. It can be active, it can be passive at some level, but it's keeping something from somebody else. And, you know, we have a concern here about concealment on what happened in connection with July 5th.
How about the destruction of evidence?
Again, that can be personal, or it can be knowing that someone else is going to do it, but it is obviously destroying evidence or information that has evidentiary value.
I guess what I'm kind of struggling with a little bit, I was actually asked over the weekend whether or not I think she should have been charged. I can't answer that question because I don't think she was interviewed properly. And it's very difficult to go back and conduct a proper interview after one has already been botched. Did you see all of the questions that you and I just went over in the 302? Were all of those asked of her during that July interview?
I think one of the concerns that's been raised is that a 302 only being a summary of what was said, that there isn't a transcript or other more definitive report on precisely all the questions and answers. So we have a summary, and that's what we're working off of that. It's an extensive summary, but it's still not a transcript.
Well, given the fact that you and I agree that actually talking to the witness, the suspect, the target might be, absent a contemporaneous recording, some of the better evidence on knowledge and intent, how in the hell was Jim Comey able to draft an exoneration press release 6 weeks before that interview took place?
I think it's clear from looking at what we uncovered that by that point in time, they had largely concluded what they had concluded.
But my question is, if what you're missing was knowledge and or intent, and the single best repository for that evidence is the person you've yet to talk to, how in the hell can you make that conclusion?
I think I'll give you what the answer was that we got back, which was, of course, we kept open the possibility that we would find some evidence that would change that view. That was the explanation we were given.
If that were true, did you find drafts of inculpatory press releases?
We did not.
You found no memos or drafts where he had decided to charge her?
That's correct. We were told, by the way, by the prosecutors, as you see here, that they did not draft anything until after the interview, precisely because they wanted to wait before making a final judgment for the interview.
Isn't that what we normally do? Wait until the last interview is? It's my last question I'll have for you. Back when you did trial work, do you remember the judge ever admonishing the jury that you are not to make up your mind until the last witness has testified and the last piece of evidence has been introduced? Do you remember a jury ever being told that by a judge?
Not only do I remember that as a prosecutor, but I actually served on a jury last year. So I remember that from the judge's instruction.
It's kind of one of the basic precepts of our justice system is that you wait until it's over before you draw a conclusion. And I am just dumbfounded that Director Comey would draft a press release and cite the missing element when the single best repository of potential evidence on that element had yet to be talked to. I find that stunning. But I'm also stunningly out of time. So I'll go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And from the Amazon jungles to the streets of Shalimar, Florida, I've had a chance to observe the patriotic service of many frontline FBI agents, and I'm in violent agreement with Director Wray that the information in your report does not in any way impugn the incredible work that they do. Refresh my recollection. We know who Lisa Page is. She sent all these bad text messages about Donald Trump, but we don't know who FBI agents 1 through 5 are. Why the disparate treatment?
So when we write up our report, we apply Privacy Act and other laws to decide whose name we can disclose and whose name, on balance, we think as a legal matter we can't. That's why you see some names in here and some names anonymized. We have the request from the committee. As I mentioned, we sought to get approval from the FBI to send that information forward.
What was the reason the FBI gave you as to why we couldn't learn who FBI agents 1 through 5 are?
They mentioned a couple of reasons, but the primary reason was that because those individuals, 2 of them were agents, one's a lawyer, work on counterintelligence matters, they had a security and safety.
Peter Strzok worked on counterintelligence matters, and we know who he is.
That's correct.
Why the disparate treatment?
I'm just telling you what was reported to us, and as I've
Who's attorney number 2?
I have to think about who that is, but I'd want to make sure that what I was saying wasn't putting someone in jeopardy or at risk. And
what was the reason the FBI gave for not telling us who attorney number 2 is?
Same reason, that individual works on counterintelligence matters and safety and security reasons, as well as some other reasons.
What were they? I want to obtain the full universe of reasons because, I feel as though sunshine, transparency will be the way to root out this bias that we seem to see reflected. Are you familiar with the resistance movement in this country?
I am familiar with it from looking at some of these text messages, but I am not personally.
What's your general understanding of what that movement is?
I just could tell you what it says here. Somehow, resist what's going on in the country in terms of the government, governance. I have no real personal knowledge.
Does it mean resist Donald Trump? Resist his presidency?
That's my understanding, certainly as it was played out here.
So you've got Peter Strzok, who goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the FBI Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. You've got Lisa Page, who goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the FBI Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. And then you have attorney number 2, who similarly goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. It seems like a very bizarre coincidence that the way people tended to end up on the Mueller probe was some association with Hillary Clinton, whether it was the people I just identified or whether it was Andrew Weissman, who attended Hillary Clinton's election night party, or whether it was Jeannie Rhee, who had defended the Clinton Foundation in FOIA defenses. It seems so bizarre that the people you would go and accumulate to prosecute the President of the United States and investigate him would be so intertangled with these fact patterns regarding Hillary Clinton. Does that strike you as odd?
I don't know if it strikes me as odd, other than I know it as to the 3 individuals you mentioned occurred.
Is that usual for someone who's directly tied to one element of a fact pattern to then migrate over to these other investigations?
It's an excellent point, Congressman. We actually make that here as well, that from a management matter, having done corruption cases, you wouldn't put someone who just investigated an individual on one side to go investigate the other person.
Who made those staffing decisions?
Would have been the leadership of the FBI.
So it would have been James Comey who's been fired. It would have been Andrew McCabe, who has been referred for criminal prosecution as a consequence of your good work. Attorney number 2 says, "Viva la resistance," while actively investigating President Trump. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
And does it trouble you that someone who was tasked with investigating the president was associating himself with a resistance movement against the very same president?
I'll say what I said earlier. I don't care who that person was investigating. That person should not be making comments about an individual or related to a person they're investigating or the FBI is working on.
Well, it will be totally unacceptable to my constituents to say that there was a person who went from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe, who identified himself and who you identified as the lead FBI lawyer on the Mueller probe, and we don't get to know who that person is, associating with the resistance, going after the president after this totally botched Hillary Clinton email investigation that you've appropriately highlighted. In this country, we cannot live in a world where unelected people at the FBI get to shelter someone who I believe was actively working against the president and actively associating and identifying with a movement that is intended to frustrate everything that this president is trying to do. So I hope we get that information, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Inspector General Horowitz, not only for your long patience today, but for your professionalism on so many levels. One of the things that I think the facts seem to bear out from this hearing today, that there was bias by key investigators collecting evidence. Their investigative evidence was provided then to prosecutors. These prosecutors, based on that evidence, acted accordingly without any bias of their own in coming to their conclusions. Is it possible that prosecutors can be misled by biased investigators who guide or withhold evidence?
It's certainly a possibility, and something like that could happen. We didn't, in the evidence we reviewed, we didn't see that here, but certainly.
Well, given the actions of the investigators expressing bias, which was very detailed in the report, and the statements and draft statements of the director months before the investigation was complete, do you think it possible they already had an outcome in mind?
Oh, well, I think clearly they had the FBI, through Director Comey, had an outcome in mind, given the drafting starting in early May.
And while prosecutors were found to be unbiased in their conclusions, did that same conclusion exist with those making investigative decisions, whose evidence would ultimately be provided to the prosecutors?
Well, Director Comey, obviously heading up the FBI and his folks, we lay out here that they believed by early May that absent confession, some unusual event or discovery of evidence they didn't anticipate, or false statements, that they thought this was heading towards a declination.
And I guess that that's the concern that the American people have, is the investigation was not even closed, that we have the Bureau, the Justice Department. In fact, in your own reports, and I quote, "We were particularly concerned about the text messages sent by Strzok and Page that potentially indicated or created the appearance that investigative decisions they made were impacted by bias or improper considerations." Along that same vein, quote, "We did not have confidence that Strzok's decision to prioritize the Russia investigation over following up on the mid-year related investigative lead discovered on the Wiener laptop was free from bias." And then a last one to highlight here. "It is not only indicative of a biased state of mind, but even more seriously implies a willingness to take official action to impact the presidential candidate's electoral prospects." And then you highlight that this is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Justice Department, and I think that's true. In your report, you discuss also that Mr. Comey was concerned about a classified issue specific to Lynch, and that there are questions that many of us have related to these issues that arose in March 2016 that alleged bias or attempts by Attorney General Lynch to impede the mid-year investigations, and that some of that information suggests or could that Comey may have also been attempting to influence the investigation. Your report says that you detail perhaps some answers to some of these questions and others in a classified appendix. When will you provide the committee's copies of the classified index?
So that classified appendix was classified by the intelligence community. We don't do that. It ended up, we're not the classifiers. They classified it at such a high level, some of the information, that it made it impossible to make it available to the members as we wanted to. Only certain members would have been able to see it. We have gone back to the intelligence agencies and say, please let us know what is this material that gets us to this level so we can bring it down to a level where everybody can look at it. We just got a report back from some of the intel agencies today. We're hoping, or last night, we're hoping to get the rest of it in the next few days. I've raised this with the Deputy Attorney General's office that we need this changed. You need to see it. It's important for the Congress to see it, and we're going to work hard to get that.
Absolutely. And can the House hold a copy in our secure
That's exactly what I want to do.
an unredacted copy?
Right. That's exactly what I'm working.
Because we've been through this rodeo before, and I've gone down to the tank and I've read redacted things, and then had members, high-placed members of our Bureau and Justice Department say, well, this is because of Freedom of Information Act redactions, as if that were a grounds to withhold information from Congress. Which agency in specific? Is it the CIA that's making the determination that members of committees are not authorized to view the classified index?
My understanding is it's speaking with the ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and the CIA, that they're working through these issues with the FBI.
Well, I thank you for that, Inspector General, and thank you for your great work. And we will be right there backing you up that oversight and judiciary committees with obvious jurisdiction need, for the sake of the American people, to see what it is that they are concealing. And we await those answers. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for your time today and your dedicated work. I'm going to speak fast. 18 U.S.C. Section 793F reads in relevant part, as you know, whoever being entrusted with or having lawful possession or control of any document or writing relating to the national defense through gross negligence permits the same to be removed from its proper place of custody or delivered to anyone in violation of his trust shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 10 years or both. Isn't it true that Director Comey's initial draft statement, which he shared with FBI senior leadership, criticized Clinton's handling of classified information as, quote, grossly negligent?
That's correct.
And according to your report, Lisa Page is identified as the person who raised concerns about the term gross negligence in that draft statement, and it was later replaced with the phrase, quote, extremely careless. Is that right?
That's correct.
Isn't it true that gross negligence is a legal term with criminal implications, while extremely careless is a subjective term with no criminal implications?
Correct.
I want to pick up on what Chairman Gowdy asked you a few moments ago, and you've said a couple of times today the focus in this particular investigation was on actual knowledge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The problem I have, and the real question here, is that that's not a standard of focus or an interpretation that's provided in the express language of the operative statute. Isn't that right?
That's correct. And when I say this investigation, obviously means the department's mid-year investigation, not our review.
Right. And so the department used this application of the statute. There's no express language in the statute to give them that authority. The question is, where did that come from? By what authority did these investigators unilaterally decide to employ an actual knowledge standard in interpreting the statute?
Well, as we looked at the written evidence, the documents, and then interviewing the prosecutors, they described their rationale for interpreting the statute that way as both a legal consideration because of concerns over whether a prosecution would be upheld if it was successful, and their belief that based on the legislative history of the statute, it required something more than pure gross negligence, and the statute's absence of a definition of gross.
And was there any precedent, specific precedent for them to do that?
They were relying on prior department precedents. In other words, how the department, they believed, interpreted the statute over time.
Let me move on. Of course, everyone in America now knows the sordid history and the infamous text messages between FBI agents Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, including the August 8, 2016 exchange where Strzok assured Ms. Page that they would, quote, stop the election of Donald Trump. Isn't it reasonable to conclude that criminal charges brought against Mr. Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton, would hurt her campaign and thus potentially help Donald Trump to be elected?
I think it's probably a given.
A matter of common sense,
think a little
right?
bit about.
And wouldn't that outcome be the opposite of what Strzok promised his paramour in those text messages that we have all seen now?
I guess so, though frankly I haven't stepped back and thought about, and frankly haven't focused on what the implications of it ultimately could be as it played out. Just sort of as it was problematic.
Well, the American people have, and many Americans would logically conclude that this political bias directly affected specific investigative decisions and judgment calls, but we'll disagree about that. I'm running out of time. I want to get to something that's very personal for you. By all accounts, you're an American patriot. You're an esteemed and trusted public servant, and we would thank you for that service. Let me ask you this personal question. Is the American people's trust in our justice system and the people's faith in our institutions important to you as an individual?
Absolutely.
And do you believe those things are important to our republic as a whole?
Yes.
In your important role at DOJ, do you believe you have a personal duty to help guard the integrity of and maintain the people's faith in our institutions?
Yes.
Let me ask you this very important question then, based on that. If your report had concluded that the evidence showed that improper considerations, including political bias of FBI agents, did directly affect specific investigative decisions, do you think that would have risked eroding the American people's trust in our justice system and the people's faith in our institutions?
It could have had could have had a greater impact. I think this has an impact. standing alone.
But would you agree that it stands to reason that a man in your position might be tempted to rationalize a report that political bias did not affect the Clinton investigation as somehow serving a greater good of not completely undermining the country's faith in our FBI?
Look, I look at this evidence, and my team looks at this evidence based on our judgments, our best judgments on this. We don't pull our punches because of concerns over how it'll seem or appear. I think anybody who tells me that having just completed an investigation where I called the former FBI director insubordinate and issued a report about the deputy director lying under oath, I don't think anybody can accuse us of pulling our punches on that.
Could you at least see, I'm out of time, could you at least see how reasonable people might reach a different conclusion, though?
As I said in my opening, Congressman, the purpose of laying out this in 500-plus pages is precisely so the American public, who are the people who I serve, we all serve, can make their own judgments. And people will agree or disagree. We've done our best to put our judgment on it. I would just assure everybody we didn't pull any punches on it.
Appreciate your service. I yield back.
Gentleman from Louisiana yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the chair. What a long day, Mr. Horowitz. Thank you for your patience. You know, following up on the gentleman from Louisiana's style of questioning as well as content, would it be fair to conclude by the American people that a hearing such as this is designed to discredit an ongoing investigation, criminal investigation, by the special counsel Robert Mueller, and using your report to do that? Might that be something?
I'm not going to speculate.
Of course you're not.
On anybody's
Of course
intent
you're
here.
not. But that kind of leading question deserves a leading question in return. One suspects sitting here that we're up to no good. Two committees with a big hearing to try to prove that there was such unbelievable bias within the FBI, political bias, that it taints everything they're doing. And I look at your conclusion. You say there are many lessons to be learned from the Department and the FBI's handling of the mid-year investigation, but among the most important is the need to respect the institution's hierarchy and structure and to follow established policies, procedures, and norms, even in the highest profile and most challenging investigations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it established policy, Mr. Horowitz, DOJ policy, to disband an investigation, an ongoing investigation, because, say, somebody's personal lawyer says it's an investigation that will be cleared up with a pardon?
No policy.
There's no such policy.
Correct.
In fact, that would be bad policy, would it not?
That would not be a good policy.
Is it established Department of Justice policy to disband an investigation because, let's say, the subject or one of the potential subjects of the investigation calls it a witch hunt?
No, I think as the director said yesterday during our Senate hearing that decision is made solely by the FBI. And
is it established Department of Justice policy to disband an ongoing criminal investigation because a high-level government official says it's time to wrap it up?
Not unless it's someone who has authority over it and has made that conclusion that it's a reasonable based on the facts and the law.
So I take your report to basically say we have to return to a normal process and allow investigations to work their will, but we can't infect them with bias. I thought I read in your report, despite hours of hearings here with 76 members, I thought your report concluded that in the conclusion with respect to Secretary Clinton's emails, you did not detect any evidence of the effect of bias in that conclusion.
On the conclusion of the prosecutors on whether or not to charge.
Right. So despite all this Sturm und Drang, there's no evidence that a bias influenced that conclusion.
The prosecutor's conclusion, correct.
By the way, I remember Mr. Nadler a little earlier asking you about because we're hearing so much about two particular FBI agents who favored apparently Hillary Clinton or at least did not like Mr. Trump. A lot of us joined in that sentiment. But are you aware of any FBI agents who in fact loved Mr. Trump and didn't like Mrs. Clinton?
We looked at the team that worked on this investigation and the Clinton email investigation, and we reported what we found in terms of biased text.
Did anyone ever refer you to, say, the New York field office of the FBI?
There were comments made by the FBI General Counsel about his understanding of the view of agents in the New York field office.
My time is almost up, and there are a lot of people who believe the New York office had profound bias that was anti-Clinton that actually influenced Mr. Comey's thinking. I just wish the fervor shown here was reflected in our willingness to look objectively at other needs for investigation, especially with respect to cabinet members in the current administration. I believe we now have over 50 subpoena requests in my committee to the chairman, none of which have been issued. I wish we had in-depth hearings with respect to potential corruption and ethical lapses by members of the cabinet, but we haven't done that. But we are going to spend a joint committee hearing, full committee, looking in the past at something that's already been adjudicated. I want to thank you, Mr. Horowitz, and your colleagues for a fine piece of professional work, and I hope it doesn't get distorted through this process. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Okay, we've already spent a lot of time on Mr. Strunk and Ms. Page, but they have obviously said things that you would consider that they had a strong bias towards Ms. Clinton becoming president, correct?
We were concerned about their bias statements, yes.
Right. Oh, and by the way, if something happens or they make decisions that favor Ms. Clinton and they have talked about bias towards Ms. Clinton, you will not say that it has necessarily affected their decision, correct? You will give them the benefit of the doubt in your paper?
I don't know if it's right to say we give them the benefit of the doubt as opposed to we would go and look for the evidence to see if we could find evidence of bias.
Okay, but if they make a decision that happens to favor Ms. Clinton or happens to hurt Mr. Trump, you do not by itself say that's an indication of bias?
Well, I would say that with regard to the October decision to not prioritize the Wiener laptop and prioritize the Russia investigation, we reached the determination we were concerned that it could have evidenced bias.
Okay. Now, there were 5 other people that you mentioned specifically in the report that apparently said things that would indicate they either did not like Mr. Trump, correct?
3 others plus the 2 of them, 5
plus the
total.
3, so a total of 5. Did you find anybody else in any of the emails you looked at throughout the investigation, even minor bit players, that would indicate political bias?
We saw in various messages sort of discussions that were tangential, in our view, to the events, and so I can't sit here and I have to check to see which side everybody was on and who they spoke about, but nothing that we thought connected in any way.
Okay, but there were other comments on the election.
There's going to be people making comments.
Of course they're going to make comments. I'm
just hesitant to say.
It would seem to me in this environment it would stick in your mind if anybody happened to make a comment indicating they wanted President Trump to win. Do you ever remember any comments like that from any of these emails?
I don't remember anything as I sit here.
Okay. Several of these people were involved in more than one investigation, which kind of concerns me. Was it a coincidence that people who had an anti-Trump bias wound up in 2 separate investigations or 3 separate investigations?
Well, what we describe here is the decision was made in July after the Clinton investigation was closed in Director Comey's announcement and the Attorney General's announcement when the Russia matter opened to take some of those same members and put them on that next investigation, which we state is, from a management standpoint, something we would be thought was.
Was it a coincidence, though,
decision.
they happened to be Clinton partisans? I guess that's my concern. Of all these seas of FBI people, we're told they're so professional, is it a coincidence that people who have so brazenly expressed anti-Trump sentiment would wind up on these 2 key political investigations?
Well, just keep in mind, these texts aren't discovered till 2017 when we start our review. So,
right, I understand that, but what you think was it hits me as unusual, given the huge volume of work the FBI has to do, that these clearly anti-Trump people wound up on these 2 politically charged investigations. No?
Look, I don't know exactly how they ended up on the other investigation, other than Mr. Strzok was at the time the Deputy Assistant Director of Counterintelligence. So,
yep. Are you investigating the Russian investigation?
We are now looking at, in light of the referrals we've had over the last several months, the question about the FISA issues that were referred to us, as well as the campaign-related questions that have been referred to us.
Okay, but you're not prepared yet to talk about any information.
No, it's certainly
political bias there,
premature. We're still investigating it for the very reasons that people have expressed concern about the
I'll give you a broader question, which involves not just this investigation, but the whole what we'll call the swamp. I don't mean this to be a partisan thing, because I think this was an unusual presidential election. It wasn't really a Republican versus Democrat election. It was kind of a swamp versus non-swamp. Because a lot of the Republicans, I don't think, wanted Mr. Trump to win either, because they were kind of wedded to the swamp. When I look at the voting results in the District of Columbia and surrounding areas, I think the whole country in general is about half Clinton, half Trump. But you look at Montgomery County, 19% Trump, Alexandria County, 17%, Arlington County, 16%, Prince George County, 8%, District of Columbia, 4%. We're living in an area here which is just so out of whack with the rest of the country, so right across the board that it's hard to believe. Are we in a situation here in which, not just regard to the FBI, but other federal agencies as well, we have to worry that political bias may creep into decision-making? And my constituents are worried, IRS, EPA, everything, that if it's known that they are supporters or people who want to reduce the swamp, that these agencies may come after them. Is this should be an overriding concern of people living in this rather unusual area here?
The gentleman's out of time, but you may answer the question.
Mention, Congressman, I think what's so concerning about this and these texts is because it creates that appearance, and rightfully so, that concern. The Justice Department and the FBI has offices in every part of this country. Some parts of the country have voting records one way, some have the other way. When you show up in an office and you work for the Justice Department, you work for the FBI, it doesn't matter whether you're in a red state, a blue state, a purple state, a red district, a green district. It should have zero bearing. You walk in that door, if you can't be a professional and walk in that door and do your job, you got to get a different job. That's what it's all about. And I've seen commentators write about this, and I had a colleague in Southern District of New York who's written about this. We went to the office, and I didn't know what my colleagues' political views were. I just knew they cared about investigating the heck out of the case, and if someone deserved to be charged, they were charged, and if someone deserved to be convicted, they brought the case to the courtroom to see if they could, to see what the jury would decide. And that's what the Justice Department's about. And if you can't walk in the door and leave your views behind, you got to get a different job.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman in Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was reported that on May 15th, you completed a draft of the report that we're discussing today, and then you circulated all of it or portions of it to various individuals, Mr. Comey, McCabe, Loretta Lynch, Lisa Page, Peter Strzok. Were there others that received the portions of that draft?
So individuals who provided voluntary testimony, whose conduct is critiqued in here, as a matter of fairness, and we do this in every single review we do, we change no practices here. We give them a chance to come in as a matter of fairness to tell us if they think we got it wrong, or to give us additional evidence if they think we missed something.
Right.
And
so
that's
I appreciate that. You testified to that earlier today. So I'm wondering, did you give it to anyone else other than those people I just named?
Yes. So the individuals in here who you see's conduct was critiqued, we would give it to them. And as a matter of course, every IG does this. We give it to the department.
And that would be like so you gave it to, and I don't mean to interrupt, but we only have 5 minutes. I've been waiting for hours. You've been very good here, being many hours, but you've got to at least talk, and I haven't got to do that till just now, and I live to talk. So I guess what I'm asking is, did you give it to Prosecutor 1, Agent 1? They all got it, right? So did they respond? Did
Some
these people...
did, some didn't.
Okay. And I guess my question at this point is, we've sent you a letter asking for copies of the original draft, any alterations made, edits, red lines, and I hope that we can get that from you. I want to go to, is there a chance we're going to get any of that information from you?
What I'd like to do is we normally do, and I like to do, is engage with you and the committee about it. I understand the concern. I want to talk it through with you and the other members who signed the letter and the chairs and the ranking member and have a candid discussion about it.
Love to do that. We can do that offline.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So you testified earlier this morning when Mr. Jordan from Ohio first questioned you. He took several hits at you. You must have felt like a piñata. Don't feel bad.
Not at all.
I get that all the time. That Peter Strzok led the the Hillary Rodham Clinton the investigation into her emails. You remember saying that?
Yes.
Okay. And then on page 148 of your report, you mentioned the critical roles that both Strzok and Page played in most of the decisions made by the FBI, right?
Correct.
Fair statement. And
yes.
And so Lisa Page's duty was she was advising the Deputy Director Andrew McCabe legally, and from reading this, I get the impression that on a lot more than legal, she's given me perhaps even some strategic information and advice as well and counsel. And as you just said, Mr. Strzok, he basically led the investigation, and he was acting in some ways through that chart of order. He's kind of the liaison between all the other analysts and the decision makers. But he is kind of in the decision making because he's always there, the decision making body. He's given inputs, and that's what I want to talk about today. We've been talking about bias a lot, and everybody walks in with bias, and you have to be able to set it aside. But in this particular thing, the output, and the way you phrased it, and you've been very careful as you've answered today, and in this report, you said it didn't. The bias of these people did not directly affect the outcome. But I'm here to suggest to you that inputs affect outcomes. The outputs come on. So when you have this very notion of these people, for all we know, they're filtering information. We don't know anything really what's going on in the decision-making process. You can't recreate it, but we know that there's certain outputs, and those outputs point to Hillary Clinton's not going to be charged. The biases that are reflected by these two people who have extraordinary inputs seems to indicate that they could have impacted those outputs. Am I wrong on that? I mean, I view what you've said here. So what I want to say is, could they have indirectly affected the outcome here?
It could have, and we don't rule it out. And frankly, I think what you have a right to expect from us is this kind of report, laying out the facts so that you and every member and every person in this country can make their own assessment.
Well, I will say in my last second, that you've written a report that the other folks that disagree with me will say that, see, there was no bias here. You know, if there was any bias, it was against Hillary Clinton. And people on my side look at it and say, you got people working here in the highest levels who appear to have been controlling and the inputs that are going into the decision-making process, and that indicates that the ultimate output may indeed have been biased. Thank you. I have no further time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, let me paint a little picture of the FBI that I knew for many years, and I think most would agree. They are the premier law enforcement agency, not just in the United States, but I think most likely in the world. Would you agree with that?
I think they're viewed, and I'll say one of, because we oversee other law enforcement agencies at the Justice Department.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll let you off the hook on that one. But also that Mr. Strzok, who's risen to a very high level within that organization has to be a premier agent within the premier agency, the FBI.
That's certainly what we were told.
You agree with that?
Yeah.
And so, and in fact, I don't know that the FBI, at least in the 40 years that I've been in law enforcement, ever conducted an investigation that brought the integrity of the agency and the investigative process under such scrutiny and questioning of the integrity of the agency. Would you agree with that?
It certainly has brought incredible scrutiny and undercut the credibility of the organization in a way that is unfair to all these thousands of agents out there.
Exactly. And I've never seen anything like it. And in fact, even Agent Strzok, I don't know of anything in his past that ever questioned his integrity and his service to the FBI or his country.
I'm not aware of anything.
So when I look at your report, and then you outline several investigative and prosecutorial missteps in this particular case, and I'll read just a few of them for you. This is from the Roman numeral 1 in the summary. The preference for consent over compulsory process to obtain evidence. Decision to obtain, not to obtain, or to seek to review certain evidence, such as the personal devices used by Secretary Clinton's senior aides. The use of voluntary witnesses over these interviews. Quote, decisions to enter into letter use or queen for a day immunity agreements with 3 witnesses, some of which I think might have been potential targets as well, had the potential anyway. The use of consent agreements and active production immunity to obtain the laptops used by Clinton's attorneys, Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson, to cull her personal and work-related emails. The handling of the Clinton interview on July 2nd. The tarmac meeting. The mid-year exam delay and looking into the Anthony Weiner laptop situation. Director Comey's drafting of an exoneration letter in May. So my question is, when you look at these things in their totality, you look at them individually, you may not see much, but you know, in a civil rights prosecution, you look at patterns or practices that will overcome any written policy that they may be presenting, and all a plaintiff has to do is show a pattern or practice to overcome a defense by an organization that, you know, we have this policy against the, So when you say that you found political bias, but it had no effect on the investigation, it seems to negate this pattern of practice that clearly existed in this investigation.
I want to say we didn't find that it didn't have any impact on the investigation. We couldn't possibly have looked at all these decisions, as you said, that covered all this period of time. What we found was focused on the individual investigations, and I think what's important for people to understand is, our responsibility as inspectors, as an inspector general or as inspectors general, in looking at these issues, is not to say this was thorough or not thorough, or the best choice or not the best choice, or could have been done more aggressively or not, but we're looking at, was there misconduct?
Let me ask one more question very quickly. Have you ever seen a public relations campaign mounted surrounding an investigation like we saw here, where there's a SAC conference so that the agency can pass down information on this case so that they can swat down, quote, swat down stories about it, and they even briefed retirees. Have you ever seen that before?
It's a great question, Congressman. Actually, the first in yesterday's hearing and today who's asked about that portion of the report, and it doesn't directly affect this investigation, but for the reasons you indicated, I think we were concerned, particularly in the context of when it was occurring, which was in October.
Correct.
During the campaign. And in our view, you look at that and you say, you know what, when there's a campaign going on and either side sort of commenting on this, the best place for the Justice Department to be is on the sidelines. The political debate will be the political debate. It might be fair, it might be unfair, but when you start doing that and sending out talking points across the country,
right,
you might actually be encouraging people, maybe unintentionally, we didn't make an intent finding here, but maybe unintentionally encouraging people to, as you suggested, get the word out. Well, it may cause other people to want to speak who maybe don't agree with the talking points. And so that was one of the areas that we had concern about, and I appreciate you raising that, Congressman, because I do
My
agree
time
with
is
you.
up. I just can't figure out how Peter Strzok is still at the FBI.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, General Horowitz. I have a very high regard for you. I think you know that. Your report states that various witnesses told you that the mishandling of classified information was a persistent practice of the State Department, and that the State Department was so screwed up in the handling of classified information that if they'd wanted to prosecute Secretary Clinton, that they'd had to prosecute 150 State Department people. Does that basically invalidate the statute?
It doesn't. That's what they told us was one of their rationales, though, for it.
Well, I don't know if you're going to allow me to do this with you, but I want to do this in regard to the statement of an insurance policy, okay? It's not in regard to the Russia probe. I know that's coming later. But obviously, Andrew McCabe put Peter Strzok in charge of the Russia probe. Are you aware that Strzok went to London in July of 2016?
I've learned of that through various public reports.
And I think it would be fair to say that McCabe approved that trip and approved the expenditures for that.
I don't know the answer one way or the other.
I just wonder if what other justification there could have been for a trip to London at that particular time other than the Russia probe. And what concerns me was that when he returned, he almost immediately launched that probe. Mm-hmm. That McCabe, I think, approved him going to London. He came back and he launched it. Do you think there's any possibility that Strzok had prior knowledge that Christopher Steele was assembling the dossier?
You know, that's one of the issues we have been asked to look at, and so we're in the middle of that work on how that played out with regard to the FISA application.
And I'm glad that you made that point, because I think another question I need to ask, was there any possibility that the dossier was at least part of Strzok's insurance policy? Because that statement came later, mm-hmm. I believe.
Right. The insurance policy statement came up on.
Well, here's what concerns me about it, is that you've got McCabe, whose wife received almost $700,000 in campaign contributions from the Clintons, was almost 40% of her total campaign contributions. And obviously there was a very strong relationship. McCabe put Strzok in charge of this. He either sent Strzok to London or allowed him to go, approved it. Do you think that either of them had knowledge that the Clinton campaign paid for the dossier?
I don't know the answer as I sit here, but that is something as part of the review that we're doing. It will be touched on in terms of the dossier.
Well, and I appreciate that. I look forward to reading that report. And I understand what you're trying to do, but let me ask you this in regard to bias. And I want to be maybe the one guy that doesn't go over time today. All things being equal, and if someone said they thought that another inspector general would be more qualified than you to do this investigation, I think we'd both agree that there was some bias involved there. It might be qualified, it might be justified, but there'd be some bias there that they preferred someone else over you. Okay. But if that same person called you and your colleagues pieces of crap, and that's not what the word they used, or repeatedly refer to you as loathsome or an idiot, awful, use the F word in regard to you, refer to your team as retarded, crazies, or, as Mrs. Clinton said, deplorables, I think that would go beyond bias. I think you might even consider that extreme prejudice or maybe even extreme animus. Would you agree with that?
Look, I think, as we've talked about, when we presented...
I'm just asking this, hypothetically, if I were responsible for the job, the assignments you got, and I made comments privately like that about you that later became public, how would you feel about that?
Oh, I think it certainly is evidence of a biased state of mind like we...
But it would indicate that I had made a determination that I was going to prevent you from advancing your career. I just would ask you, would you have any confidence that you would be treated fairly under those circumstances?
I think you'd have reason for concern, and it's precisely why this is so problematic.
And especially if it were persistent right to the very end. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. A January 14th, 2016 letter from IG Charles McCullough discusses sworn declarations that dozens of Secretary Clinton's emails were top secret and special access program levels. This information, as you well know, is so sensitive that even for IG McCullough, he had to get special clearance in order to even see them. Treating information like this improperly would almost certainly have resulted in serious consequences for just about anybody, not in this situation. This letter from IG McCullough, was out well before Comey changed the May memo language from, quote, gross negligence to extremely careless. And since we have a lot of viewers watching this, and we tend to in this committee, both of these committees, be very legalese, could you describe for everyone the difference between those two phrases?
Well, gross negligence is a legal term found in Section 793. Whereas extremely careless is a non-legal term to describe, or as used here by former Director Comey, to describe what his characterization was of the conduct.
So did I hear you correctly that there's really nothing in the U.S. Code that deals with, quote, extreme carelessness or extremely careless when it comes to handling classified information?
Correct.
Okay. So information classified at this level contains very critical information, critical to national security, protecting the identity of U.S. intelligence assets. Is it possible that Comey chose extremely careless or extreme carelessness precisely because of the fact that that phrase is not in the U.S. Code?
In fact, that's what we were told is the reason for the change was to take it from what was in the statute to something outside the statute.
Well, thank you. I think all of us on the committee and those watching appreciate that clarity. I want to follow up on something that Chairman Gowdy brought up earlier, and that has to do with the interview process. Secretary Clinton was voluntarily interviewed rather than appearing before the grand jury?
That's correct.
Were Secretary Clinton's attorneys, Mr. Mills and Samuelson, I believe their names, were present for that interview?
There were multiple lawyers present, including Ms. Mills and Ms. Samuelson.
Mills and Samuelson, interesting. Were they not also witnesses in this investigation?
They were.
It would strike me that's a little bit unusual to have witnesses a party to an interview with the subject of the investigation.
Which is why we found that it was not consistent with normal investigative practice. And actually, Director Wray yesterday also suggested that.
Was that interview recorded?
It was not.
Why?
The FBI, as a matter of its practice, does not record interviews of witnesses.
Is that one of your recommendations to change that? I would hope so.
We actually don't have that in a recommendation. That's been a subject of discussion for many, many years within the Justice Department.
So there was a written report?
There was a written summary report of the interview.
Oh, so only a summary. So when I read your report, the IG report, that the decision not to prosecute Secretary Clinton was essentially made prior to her interview. Did I read that correctly?
What we were told is, absent a confession or a false statement, the plan was to close the investigation immediately after the interview.
So if the decision not to prosecute was largely made prior to even talking to her, how could it, and there's been all of the discussion today about whether or not she had willful knowledge and intent, how could anybody even know if she had willful intent or knowledge if they didn't talk with her before they made the decision? And then secondly, with the conversation and what we now know is the very extreme bias, particularly of Strzok and several other agents who, as I read the report, were part of that investigation, how can anyone really be sure that there wasn't bias in the way that interview was conducted when it went to the prosecutorial decision?
And what we went and looked at was the summary and the preparation that went into the interview to see whether the questions that were intended to be asked were in fact asked during that, in terms of whether individuals who were in the room were biased or expressed bias.
You would have there's absolutely no idea.
We wouldn't know one way or the other, although I would, say Mr. Strzok was in the room, but not one of the questioners, and we had concerns about his text messages, and one of the two questioners was one of the other three individuals we've referenced here as with problematic text messages.
Very disturbing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy. Mr. Horowitz, I have a statement and then a quick question. I go home to Kentucky every weekend, and when I'm home, I'm talking to a lot of people all across the state. My district's very vast, from one end of the state to the other. When we're home during recess, I talk to a lot of people. The biggest complaint that I hear from the good, hardworking people in my congressional district in southern Kentucky is the disgusting news that they've seen about the obvious bias from the FBI and from the investigators. And it leads in to people's minds exactly what the president's been saying, that this is a witch hunt. This is a witch hunt that every time they turn on the television, there's news about the Russia investigation, very little news on certain media outlets about the things that obviously Hillary Clinton did that were illegal. The approval ratings for the FBI and the Department of Justice now, I would assume, are at record lows, probably lower than Congress, and that's not very good. What steps must the FBI take to restore confidence, to eliminate the obvious political bias that was displayed by reading your report with the FBI in this investigation? What steps does the FBI need to take to eliminate, not reduce, but eliminate political bias in the agency? Because anytime there's an investigation of any type, one of the main items in the case is conversations with the FBI. And as Congresswoman Handel said, you don't record things in the FBI, it's your word. The word today isn't worth what it should be from the nation's premier intelligence agency. So this is a very serious issue that is dividing America. It's really frustrating those of us on the Oversight Committee that have tried to find answers from an agency that, quite frankly, has not been transparent with the American public. What steps can the FBI take in the future to eliminate this and correct this problem and restore the confidence of America?
Well, I think one of the things we've laid out here, we have 9 recommendations in here on various systemic issues. But I think, as I said in my opening and as we say here, really getting back to core values and understanding and making sure that the organization at a leadership level and at a senior level across the organization understands the principles and the norms and follows them. And again, I will say, having been in AUSA, obviously it was many years ago now, but I don't think what occurred here represents what thousands of agents would do in terms of their political views or other biases they may have. They understand they may have views, but they understand when they go to work, those views stay behind. And that's what, it's at a core level, that's what really has to happen here, because it is why these kinds of text messages are so corrosive. It's because people see them and they say, how can someone be an FBI agent who has these views? Happens in civil rights cases. How can people have views we sometimes see when you look at their messages about the people they're investigating? It can't happen.
Well, when you have an agency that has a black eye, whether it's the VA or the FBI, I think the best decision a leader could do is change leadership. And I support what President Trump did in firing Comey. I think that was the right decision. And hopefully with your report and with the work of Congress, we can work to restore the confidence of the American public in the FBI and the Department of Justice. And, Mr. Chairman, I have about a minute left. I would like to yield my time to my friend Mark Meadows.
I thank the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Horowitz. I want to come back to something we talked about earlier, the disclosure of FBI Attorney 1 and FBI Attorney 2. And you said, I think I'm correct, that they did not want that divulged because they actually worked in counterintelligence. Is that correct?
That's what we were told by the FBI.
Okay, but you know who the people are.
Correct.
And I would say, based on your report, I know who they are. Right. And what I guess I'm concerned about is you know that they don't work for the counterintelligence division.
Well, two of the agents do.
I'm talking about attorneys.
There's one lawyer who's in here. So there are 5 people total.
Right.
Paige Strzok, 2 other agents.
But you had a dialogue between FBI Attorney 1 and 2.
Correct.
And those 2 attorneys, do they not work for Trish Anderson?
Those 2 attorneys work in the Office of General Counsel.
Yeah, and so would one of those attorneys be Sally Moyer?
I'm going to defer to what the FBI.
But they don't work in counterintelligence. I mean, if that's the reason the FBI is giving, they're giving you false information because they work for the General Counsel.
Just add, they were talking
Is the other one Kevin Kleinsmith?
They were talking about the other attorney there that we have their text messages in here that they were concerned about, along with the other 2. I'm not here to articulate the FBI's interest. We oversee the FBI.
We're going to get to the bottom of it, like Mr. Comer was talking about. And I think the other thing that I would ask you to look into, there is growing evidence that 302s were edited and changed. And it gets back to what Ms. Handel said in terms of those particular interview sessions. And those 302s, it is suggested that they were changed to either prosecute or not prosecute individuals, and that is very troubling, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And if I could just mention, we have been getting those kind of referrals, and as often happens when we issue reports like this, we get other information coming to us, and we are intending to follow up on that. But I just want to reassure you and the committee, I'm here to let you know what we're being told by the FBI is their concerns. Obviously, Director Wray and the leadership of the FBI and ourselves, I'm certainly not looking to step aside on this, but it is their interests that they need to be articulated to the committee.
Gentleman with North Carolina yields back. The gentleman, Mr. Rothfuss, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Inspector, for being here this afternoon and all day here. You identified a lot of devices that were part of the investigation in your report, the different servers and personal devices. In your investigation, did you review whether those conducting the mid-year investigation searched for emails with the ClintonEmail.com route on databases that held data collected pursuant to FISA?
I'm not sure as I sit here, but I can certainly get back to you promptly on that.
Yeah, I'd like to know that. Page 186 of the report, when discussing the topic of whether the FBI would have a separate announcement from the DOJ about the declination to prosecute, Director Comey said the FBI was in the middle of a 500-year flood. And the quote here is, quote, I mean To my mind, it was a crazy idea, but we were in a 500-year flood. As you all know, as you all have now investigated enough and lived enough to know that this is a circumstance that has never happened before. We're criminally investigating one of the candidates for president of the United States. President Obama's comments obviously weighed on me as well. You've got the president who has already said there's no there. And so all of that creates a situation where how do you get out of this without grievous damage to the institution? Reading this sounds as though Director Comey, his decision in this context of having a separate statement was imbued with political considerations, does it not?
He was certainly speaking about the political perceptions that resulted from President Obama's comments and other actions he was concerned with.
Well, he was considering matters just beyond facts, wasn't
Correct.
he? Yeah.
Correct.
And he was considering how, in his own subjective view, that the FBI was going to be viewed in response to this investigation.
Agreed.
And the same would hold true not just for his July 5 press conference, but his October 28th letter.
Agree.
You wonder how the FBI gets to a point where there's a 500-year flood. You know, I represent Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and they had a horrific flood back in 1889. And there was a big rainstorm before that flood, but there were things going on years before. And if you read David McCullough's book about the flood, you understand that things were going on before. And to understand this in context, we're here today because you had the third highest official in the executive branch decide to conduct official business on a private server for whatever reason. And I read through this report and just see political consideration after political consideration. Isn't Mr. Comey's decision to usurp the authority of the Attorney General in order to protect the Bureau inherently a political decision?
I think you can certainly view it that way.
On page 10, the report states that Mr. Comey's decision-making process made an implicit assumption that President Clinton would be president. Isn't that yet another example of politics playing a role here?
It's certainly his reading the political tea leaves in his view.
When Mr. Comey described Attorney General Lynch's presence imbued corrosive doubt into the entire process, doesn't this confirm the need for a special counsel in this investigation from the very beginning?
I think if Director Comey's view was, as he laid out, the answer wasn't I'm going to take over and announce the decision. The answer was I'm going to go to the Attorney General, explain my concerns, and ask her to either recuse or get a special counsel.
You know, going back over the years and I talk about how the 500-year flood, things happening for years, and you look at everything that was circulating in the Clinton administration and all the scandals that we saw then and the continuing scandals. I remember the 96 campaign and the fundraising scandal there, and Charlie Tree and Johnny Chung and Johnny Wan and Maria Siai, and Louis Freeh was looking at that, the director of the FBI, and he said, it is difficult to imagine at that time a more compelling situation for an independent counsel. But Janet Reno never appointed one. Why wasn't a special counsel ever appointed in this Clinton email investigation, looking at Attorney General Lynch? Why is it that they never?
We have explanations here as to why it was. Attorney General Lynch said she didn't think the standard was met and that there should be one applied. Director Comey essentially told us that he was using it as a leverage point to get the investigation moving as opposed to it actually being presented for serious consideration.
But we see instance after instance where Director Comey was making political calculations.
Gentleman's out of time.
I think start. I'll go back to what we've talked about in here and what I talked about earlier. And as you referenced, it's easy to say there's a 500-year flood, but the reality is we're faced all the time with what people perceive to be unique circumstances. That doesn't mean you make various judgments along the way. In fact, I think many people would argue that's when it's most important to stay true to what the institution values are, norms are, procedures are. And you're right, the right approach here, if there was a concern that the Attorney General could not fairly or by appearance decide this, the right response would have been for Director Comey to present that to the Attorney General and for her to make a decision. But she ultimately was the one who was politically accountable in our system of government for that final decision, not him.
Gentleman yields back. This concludes today's hearing. I'll recognize the gentleman from Virginia and then the gentleman from Maryland for any concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Horowitz. It's been a long day. I think you're going on 7 hours here with very little respite from that, but I think you've handled yourself well, and we very much appreciate that. You know, at the beginning of this hearing, I posed the question, why should Americans care about what we're talking about here today? And unfortunately, I think we heard from some of our members that we don't care about these emails anymore. We don't care about these GD emails and texts, I assume they're referring to as well, from Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page. But I'd like everyone here to think about, what if the shoe was on their foot? What if high-ranking people in the nation's most important law enforcement organization were talking about an investigation into them, and they showed that kind of animus, that kind of bias in the process? You, Mr. Horowitz, have a number of times today made it very clear that you understand how important it is that the American people have the assurance that when it comes to the enforcement of our laws, that justice is blind, and that the guarantee of our Constitution of equality under the law for all people is fulfilled. I don't think we can say that here right now, unfortunately, about this very sorry circumstance. And we're going to continue to pursue this until we have the assurance that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice have cleaned house and are making the necessary changes to ensure that in the future, whether it's the 2020 presidential election or whether it's Jane Doe or Joe Smith's criminal investigation, that they will indeed experience equality under the law, and the kind of extreme bias that we've seen in looking at some of the most prominent investigations in American history will not happen again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia yields. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Horowitz, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank the ladies and gentlemen behind you and all of those who have had anything to do with pulling this report together. I want to thank you for the recommendations, because I think they go to the heart of the problem. You know, as I sit here and I think about life, you know, and I tell my constituents this. I tell them I wish there were not a Republican and a Democratic Party. I wish I was not a quote, politician. You know why? Because I think that when people hear us a lot of time, or hear me, they just assume that I'm saying things based upon political expediency or trying to help a party, my party. But there are certain things that are about bigger than party, like country and being a human being. And I think that when we talk about, you know, when I read your report and I look at what you've done, it's the people like the ones that are sitting behind you that take an oath to do their very, very best and to be honest and to uphold the Constitution of our country. Those are the people that will keep our democracy together. And I say it with all of the sincerity I have in my heart. Everywhere I go, Mr. Horowitz, and I want you to understand this, I've never seen so many people scared. They're scared. I mean, American citizens scared. And they're scared of where our country is going. But I think what you have done here today, that is examining, first of all, bringing to the table integrity. Bringing to the table integrity and honesty and just calling it like it is. You may have come out with a report that I didn't like. I mean, certain things I saw in the report that didn't sit well with me. But you know what? I'm able to walk away from here believing that you all upheld your oaths and your principles for honesty and integrity. Not about party, not about gender, none of that. Not pro-Trump, against Trump, Republican, whatever, but integrity. And that integrity, and I tell my staff, that integrity will you don't have to change from time to time. Whatever that integrity is and you meet that level, it's always going to be. So, the thing I'm trying to get through to you is that I want you to continue to do what you're doing. Because the people, like the people who are sitting behind you and you, are the folk who are going to make sure that this democracy, which so often we take for granted, so often we forget that this democracy allows us to be the people that we are and to do the things that we do and allow us to be all that God meant for us to be. But it takes people with that high standard, those high standards, that no matter what happens, no matter where the wind may blow, no matter how difficult it may become, no matter how unpopular it may become. And that, by the way, that's where Comey made a mistake. Comey got so, this is my own personal opinion, he got so rattled by our Republican friends trying to get the 302s and all that kind of, I think he buckled. That does not mean that he's not a good man. That means that he used poor judgment at that time. But again, the democracy is held together by us, by people, determining that and I'll close with this. I keep going back to something that Martin Luther King said, and I think about it all the time, when he talked about, and he was quoting another preacher, but he said, silence can become betrayal. Silence can become betrayal. When you see something wrong, you got to deal with it. And because if we don't, then we go down a slippery slope of betraying not only the people that we represent, all of us, and that includes, I'm just talking about all of us in government. Not only do we betray them, but we betray generations yet unborn. And so again, I thank you. And as to the FBI, Strzok and Page and the other folks, they did some damage. Ain't no doubt about it. No doubt about it. And I cannot get away from the excellent questions that the chairman asked. But I believe in my heart, and I want to listen to your answers very carefully, and how when you say that the problem originated with Comey's elevation, and he got off the track. I think the idea is that we have created a track through the practices and of the DOJ that we created a road, and all he had to do is stay on track, and he would have been fine. He may have gotten battered a bit, but he would have been fine. And that's why the integrity issue becomes so significant. And so I'm just glad that we have people like you all who are able to come to the table, and yeah, you're going to catch some hell, probably. You already have. But you can stand no matter what. And you can say, we looked at it, we gave it our best. You may not agree with us, but we believe in our hearts that these are the right decisions, And I accept that. And with that, I thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member on either committee to submit written opening statement or questions for the record. I'll just say this quickly, Mr. Horowitz, it's been a long day. There are many important and many would argue, including me, urgent issues facing our country today. Some of them have been alluded to today. But there is nothing more important and nothing is ever more urgent than us having confidence in our justice system. So I will apologize to no one for having a hearing on your report, which takes a really hard look at some institutions we desperately need. And I'll say this as a compliment to you and your team. I was thinking over the weekend how much better off our country would be had you and your team conducted the investigation that is the subject of your report. And make no mistake, you and I probably would have reached some different conclusions, as old washed-up prosecutors do from time to time. You can look at a fact pattern and draw different conclusions. I don't mind if people are wrong. I really mind if they're unfair. We can survive being wrong. We can survive calling jump balls differently. We're not going to make it if our system is perceived as being biased and unfair. So, thank you for your work. I know it took a long time, but as you correctly noted, some of the information that my colleagues found most probative came towards the end. So it's a good thing that you did not succumb to all of our pressures and wrap this thing up before its natural chronology. And we wish you the same objectivity and fact centricity that you showed in this investigation with the others. Our country, I think, is counting on you and your team to do in your subsequent investigations exactly what you've done in this one, which is just call balls and strikes, and people are welcome to draw different conclusions, but they're not entitled to their own version of the facts. With that, to you and your team, thank you. We're adjourned.